Thank you for joining for today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Red Gaze of Point Pleasant. This is a horror story about the Mothman. And in this story, a disgraced structural engineer who has returned to Point Pleasant to settle his father's estate. He is a skeptic, dismissing the local Mothman lore as small-town hysteria. However, he discovers his father's journals, which contain obsessive sketches of a winged sentinel and warnings that the creature isn't a predator, but a harbinger. It appears not to kill, but to signal an impending structural failure. The second story today is called The Screaming Sands. This is a horror story about the Jersey Devil. And in this story, a group of 5 urban explorers and amateur cryptid hunters travel deep into the heart of the Pine Barrens, far beyond the marked trails. They aren't just tourists. They are led by a disgraced biologist obsessed with proving the Jersey Devil is a relic species of prehistoric mammal. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Red Gaze of Point Pleasant. The radio chatter spilled out across the darkened asphalt like liquid static, a crackling hemorrhage of panic that refused to cohere into sense. Officer Danny Henshaw's voice, usually a flat monument of Appalachian restraint, had been sheared into something brittle and high, a tone that the dispatcher later told the investigators she had never before heard issued from a human throat over the secured band. Unit 409 to dispatch. I am at the intersection of Route 62 and Elm Hollow Road. Repeat, Route 62 and Elm Hollow, and there is a vehicle here. A dark sedan, idling in the westbound lane, doors open, engine running, driver's side door ajar, and Jesus Christ. There is ash in the seat. Dispatch. There is gray ash in the driver's seat. Wet, it is wet, and there are no footprints. Do you copy? No footprints leading away from the vehicle. Only gouges in the road, deep gouges, vertical, like something was driven into the asphalt with tremendous. No, there is no sign of the driver, no blood, just ash, just this gray. The transmission terminated in a squeal of feedback that sounded less like electronic interference and more like a scream being torn in half by gears. When backup arrived 12 minutes later, they found Henshaw standing in the drizzle with his service weapon drawn, staring at the empty sedan as though waiting for its owner to rematerialize from the fog. The ash in the driver's seat weighed exactly 4 pounds and 3 ounces, which was precisely the dry mass of an adult human male after all liquid content had been removed. The asphalt, when examined under high-intensity lamps, bore 2 parallel grooves 3 inches deep and 8 feet apart, running in a perfectly straight line from the vehicle's door toward the dark rim of the forest. The grooves terminated abruptly, as though whatever had made them had simply ascended. Henshaw was placed on administrative leave. He would be found dead in his bathtub 3 weeks later, his eyes open, his pupils dilated to black pits, his mouth frozen in an expression that the coroner quietly noted in his report as anticipatory. He had not left a note. He had, however, drawn dozens of small red circles in ballpoint pen on the bathroom tiles, all of them clustered in the upper right corner of the room, as if marking a position in the sky. Owen Caldwell did not believe in harbingers. He believed in load-bearing walls, in sheer stress, in the elegant and pitiless mathematics of torque and compression. For 15 years, he had worked as a structural engineer in Pittsburgh, certifying bridges and high-rises, translating the language of concrete and steel into proofs of human safety, until a miscalculation on the Alderton overpass, a decimal point shifted in a subcontractor's report that he had signed off on without verifying, had sent a concrete finial plummeting into rush-hour traffic, killing 4 people and maiming a 5th. The inquiry had been public and merciless. His license had been suspended. His marriage had dissolved in a silence more violent than any argument, and his name had become a synonym for negligence in the small, incestuous world of civil engineering. When the letter from the Point Pleasant municipal clerk arrived, informing him that his father had died alone in the family home on the Ohio River, and that the estate required his attention as the sole surviving heir. Owen had felt nothing except a distant, mechanical recognition that the geometry of his life had finally collapsed into a shape he deserved. He packed a single duffel bag, left his apartment in Pittsburgh without informing the landlord, and drove south along the Ohio River in a rented sedan that smelled of air freshener and regret. Point Pleasant had not changed in the 20 years since he had left it as a teenager, vowing never to return. The same brick storefronts lined Main Street, their facades weathered to the color of old teeth. The same bronze statue of the Mothman stood in the town center, its polished steel wings catching the weak autumn light, a monument to the hysteria of 1966 and 1967 that had culminated in the collapse of the Silver Bridge. Owen remembered the stories from his childhood, the red-eyed sightings, the frantic police reports, the 46 people who had died when the bridge's I-bar 330 had sheared during rush hour. But he had absorbed them then as children absorb folklore, with a skepticism that calcified into outright dismissal by the time he reached adulthood. The Mothman was a barn owl. It was a sandhill crane. It was mass psychogenic illness amplified by Cold War paranoia. It was not, and had never been, anything more than a projection of small-town dread onto the empty canvas of the night sky. His father's house stood at the end of a gravel lane on the outskirts of town, a sagging Victorian with a front porch that listed to the left like a ship taking on water. Owen had not spoken to his father in 8 years, not since a Christmas dinner that had ended with Owen calling the old man a superstitious drunk, and his father responding by throwing a whiskey tumbler at the wall with an accuracy that suggested long practice. The inside of the house smelled of mildew and pipe tobacco, a scent that triggered an involuntary spasm of memory, so sharp it felt like nausea. The wallpaper in the hallway had peeled away in strips, revealing older layers beneath, a palimpsest of faded roses and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Owen moved through the rooms with the detached efficiency of a man inventorying a stranger's belongings. The kitchen was stocked with canned goods that had expired during the Bush administration. The living room contained a television that still used vacuum tubes and a reclining chair whose upholstery had been worn to the color of a bruise. And then there was the study. The study had been his father's sanctum, a room Owen had been forbidden to enter as a child, and it retained its aura of inviolate secrecy even in death. The door stuck in its frame, swollen by humidity, and Owen had to put his shoulder against it, feeling the wood give with a sound like a sigh. The room inside was narrow and long, lit by a single window that faced the river, and every surface, every wall, every tabletop, every inch of the hardwood floor that was not covered by precarious stacks of paper, was covered in drawings. Owen stood in the doorway for a long moment, his breath shallow, feeling the first cold finger of something that might have been awe or might have been horror trace its way down his spine. The drawings were executed in charcoal, graphite, ballpoint pen, and what looked like dried blood. They depicted, with obsessive and exacting precision, a winged figure, not the cartoonish Mothman of tourist merchandise, but something skeletal and architectural, a creature composed of angles that seemed to violate the ordinary proportions of anatomy. Its wings were not feathered but membranous, stretched over a framework of elongated fingers that resembled the struts of a biplane. Its eyes were not merely red but luminescent, drawn with layers of crimson and scarlet and vermilion that seemed to generate their own light, to glow against the paper with a phosphorescence that Owen told himself was a trick of the late afternoon sun filtering through the curtains. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on a drift of paper that had slid from the desk. The journals were everywhere, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, leather-bound and spiral-bound and stitched together from loose sheets. He picked up the nearest one, dated 3 months prior, and read his father's handwriting, which had deteriorated from its former tight precision into a jagged scrawl that slashed across the page like knife wounds. "It is not a predator. I have been wrong all these years to call it a predator. It does not hunt. It does not feed. It watches. It waits. It perches on the ruined things and calculates the vectors of their undoing. It is a sentinel, a warning system evolved beyond our comprehension, and the red eyes are not organs of sight but instruments of measurement. They scan the stress fractures. They map the fatigue. They know before any instrument can detect it the precise moment when a structure will surrender to gravity. It is not the cause. It is the symptom made flesh. It is the scream before the impact. And it is getting louder. Owen closed the journal. His hands were shaking and he pressed them against his thighs to still them. He was an engineer. He did not believe in omens. But the drawings surrounded him, hundreds of red eyes staring from the walls, and for the first time since entering the house, he felt the oppressive weight of the sky pressing down through the ceiling. He spent 3 days in Point Pleasant before the disappearances began. The first was a woman named Patricia Hale, a 62-year-old retired schoolteacher who lived alone in an apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. She had been discovered missing at 6:30 in the morning when her sister, bringing coffee, found the apartment door unlocked and the bed unslept in. The police report, which Owen read in the local newspaper with a skepticism that felt increasingly like performance, noted that there were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, and no indication that Patricia had left under her own power. What the report did not mention, but which Owen heard whispered in the diner where he ate his breakfast, was that the bedroom window, which faced the alley, had been found open, and that on the windowsill the wood had been deeply scored by 4 parallel gouges that matched no known tool. The second disappearance followed 48 hours later. A teenage boy named Derek Vance, who had been smoking on the roof of his parents' garage and had simply vanished. His mother, calling him for dinner, had found the garage roof empty, his cigarettes still smoldering in a ceramic dish, his phone lying face down near the gutter. The asphalt of the driveway below bore 2 deep indentations, circular and 8 feet apart, as if a great weight had briefly pressed against it from above. Owen tried to dismiss the stories. He told himself that Patricia Hale had early-stage dementia and had wandered into the river, that Derek Vance had run away to Charleston to escape the suffocating gravity of small-town expectation. But on the 3rd night, as he lay in his father's bed listening to the house settle around him like an animal adjusting its weight, he heard a sound that he could not rationalize. It was a hum, low and resonant, felt more in the sternum than in the ear, a frequency that seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of his own heart before diverging into something slower and more ancient. He rose and went to the window, telling himself that he was only checking for a passing truck, for a generator malfunction, for any of the mundane acoustic intrusions that could explain the vibration. The street below was empty, lit by a single sodium lamp that painted the asphalt in shades of sulphurous yellow, and on the roof of the hardware store across the street, silhouetted against the glow of the distant bridge, something was standing. It was absolutely still. That was the first thing that struck Owen, the first crack in his rationalist armor, the absolute predatory stillness of the shape. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet, and its outline suggested a humanoid torso mounted on legs that bent in too many places, with wings folded against its back like a cloak of torn sailcloth. But it was the eyes that held him. 2 points of red light, not reflecting the sodium lamp but generating their own radiance, a color so deep and saturated that it seemed to bend the darkness around it, to pull the night toward those twin points like water spiraling down a drain. Owen felt his vision warp. The room seemed to tilt, the floorboards beneath his feet suddenly uncertain, as though the house had been lifted and set down at a slightly different angle. He gripped the windowsill, his knuckles white, and forced himself to look away, to stare at the baseboard, at the dust bunnies, at anything but those eyes. When he looked back, seconds or minutes later, he could not have said which. The roof was empty, but the asphalt below bore 2 fresh gouges, vertical and precise, that had not been there before. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with his father's journals spread around him like a protective fortification, reading until dawn, his coffee growing cold and then scummy. The later entries deteriorated into something approaching religious ecstasy, or perhaps madness. It showed me the bridge his father had written. Not the old silver bridge, but the new one, the one they built in 1969. It showed me the moment when the northern suspension cable will part. I saw the cars falling. I saw the water closing over them. I saw myself standing on the bank, and I was smiling because I finally understood that the gaze is a gift. The gaze is preparation. The gaze is the mercy of knowing. Owen shut the book. He understood, with the clarity of a man who has spent his professional life measuring the hidden stresses in concrete, that his father had died not of the heart attack listed on the death certificate, but of a certainty too heavy to carry. The journals were a suicide note written in installments. On the 5th day, Owen drove to the ruins of the Silver Bridge. The new bridge, the Silver Memorial Bridge, stood a quarter-mile downstream, its suspension cables humming with traffic, but the old approach roads remained, crumbling into the riverbank, choked with sumac and wild grape. Owen parked his rental at the end of the access road and walked the remaining distance, telling himself that he was there to survey the structural remnants for the estate, to determine if any of the old pilings retained salvage value, to perform the kind of practical assessment that had once defined his life. But as he picked his way through the rusted debris, his boots crunching on fragments of concrete that had been pulverized by time and frost, he felt the same spatial distortion that had seized him at the bedroom window. The world seemed to flex around him, the angles of the girders subtly wrong, the perspective of the riverbank tilting in a way that suggested the ground itself was under tension, coiled and waiting to snap. He looked up. The creature was perched on a rusted I-beam that jutted from the water like a broken bone. It was closer now, close enough that he could see the texture of its wings, which were not leathery but translucent, veined with a network of dark filaments that pulsed with the same subsonic hum he had heard in his bedroom. Its body was thin, almost emaciated, a scaffold of bone and sinew covered in a short, gray fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But the eyes, those were the focus of all visual gravity, two spheres of crimson luminescence that did not blink, that did not waver, that seemed to drill into the fabric of the world with a deliberation that was neither hostile nor benevolent but purely instrumental. The creature was not looking at him. Owen realized this with a nausea that rose in his throat like bile. It was looking past him, through him, at the ruins of the bridge, at the crumbling concrete and the corroded rebar, and its head was tilted at an angle of precise calculation, like a surveyor sighting a level. It was measuring. It was waiting. It was reading the stress fractures in the world the way Owen had once read them in blueprints, and the comprehension of this shared methodology, this horrible kinship of professional attention, was more terrifying than any monstrous roar could have been. Owen stumbled backward, his heel catching on a tangle of wire, and fell hard onto the broken concrete. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and when he looked up, gasping, the I-beam was empty. But the creature had not flown away. It had simply shifted its position, moving with a speed that defied the eye's ability to track, and now it stood on the riverbank not 10 feet from him, its wings partially unfurled, casting shadows that did not align with the angle of the sun. The hum intensified, becoming a pressure inside his skull, and Owen felt something tear inside his perception, a seam ripping open in the fabric of his ordinary vision. He saw, with the absolute certainty of a hallucination, an image that was not before him but somehow imposed upon him. The new Silver Memorial Bridge, its cables snapping in sequence like guitar strings, the deck tilting, cars sliding into the river, the water boiling with debris and screams. And in the foreground, standing on the bank with his hands in his pockets, watching the destruction with the calm satisfaction of a job well observed, was Owen himself. The vision lasted less than a second. When it released him, he was vomiting onto the concrete, his body convulsing with a violence that left him curled in a fetal position, his face inches from the rusted water. When he finally rose, trembling and empty, the creature was gone. Only the gouges remained, 2 deep tracks in the mud of the riverbank, running parallel for 8 feet before terminating in a circular depression, as though something heavy had pushed off from the earth and launched itself into the sky. Owen walked back to his car in a daze, his clothes soaked with river water and sweat, his mind repeatedly circling the image of the bridge collapse. He knew, with the engineer's certainty that had survived even his disgrace, that the new bridge was structurally sound. He had reviewed its specifications during his graduate studies, had admired its redundancy, its load distribution, its elegant solution to the problems that had doomed its predecessor. There was no reason for it to fall, and yet the vision had possessed the texture of inevitability, the weight of a future already poured and set. The town was changing. Owen could feel it in the way people moved through the streets, their shoulders hunched, their eyes fixed on the pavement. The disappearances continued. A bartender taken from the roof of the pub where he went to smoke, an elderly woman lifted from her second-story balcony while hanging laundry, her clothespins scattered on the grass below like dropped stitches. The official narrative strained to accommodate these events, runaways, accidents, voluntary disappearances. But the unofficial narrative, the narrative whispered in kitchens and shouted in bars after midnight, was cohering around a single, terrible consensus. The Mothman had returned, and it was not hunting in the manner of a predator. It was harvesting in the manner of a force of nature, with a selectivity that seemed almost agricultural. The victims were always alone. They were always elevated. And they were always, in some way, connected to the old structures of the town. The bartender had been renovating the pub's historic roof. The elderly woman lived in the oldest apartment building on Main Street, a brick structure that Owen privately noted was suffering from severe mortar degradation. Owen tried to leave. He packed his duffel bag, loaded his father's journals into a cardboard box, and drove toward the new bridge, intending to cross into Ohio and keep driving until Point Pleasant was a smudge of memory in his rearview mirror. But as he approached the bridge, the hum returned, rising from the asphalt through the tires of the rental car, vibrating the steering wheel in his hands until his fingers went numb. The red eyes appeared in his peripheral vision, not on the bridge but in the sky above it, 2 steady points of light that maintained their position relative to his windshield no matter how he turned his head. He pulled over in the breakdown lane, his heart hammering against his ribs, and when he looked up, the sky was empty. But he could not make himself drive onto the bridge. He sat there for an hour, gripping the wheel, until a state trooper tapped on his window and asked if he was experiencing car trouble. Owen had laughed then, a sound that had frightened both of them and turned the car around. He understood, with a clarity that felt like madness, that he was not being prevented from leaving. He was being kept in place for a purpose he could not yet discern. The Mothman was not interested in him as prey. It was interested in him as a witness, or perhaps as an accomplice. The Point Pleasant Historical Society occupied a cramped storefront between a bakery that smelled of artificial vanilla and a shop selling Mothman-themed keychains and shot glasses. Owen entered the following morning with the deliberate gait of a man forcing himself to perform an errand he had already decided would be futile. The interior was a labyrinth of glass display cases and yellowed newspaper clippings under fluorescent tubes that buzzed with the same frequency as the creature's hum. Behind a counter stacked with unsold commemorative plates sat a woman named Eleanor Vance, whom Owen recognized from the newspaper photographs as the mother of the vanished teenager. She was in her early 50s, her hair the color of steel wool, her eyes set in bruised hollows that suggested sleep had become theoretical. She looked at Owen not with the curiosity of a historical society docent, but with the resigned recognition of someone who had learned to identify the specific gait of men carrying unbearable knowledge. "You're Caldwell's boy," she said. It was not a question. "You look like him around the eyes, that same stare like you're measuring the distance to something no one else can see." She gestured to a chair beside the counter, and Owen sat, his knees creaking. "I suppose you've come about the journals. Everyone comes about the journals eventually, once they realize the police aren't going to find anything and the federal boys won't even return our calls." Owen opened his mouth to deny it, to claim that he was merely researching property values, but the lie died before it reached his tongue. "I found them in his study," he said instead. "Hundreds of drawings, and claims that the creature, that it doesn't kill, that it warns." Alina laughed, a sound like gravel shifting in a dry creek bed. She reached beneath the counter and withdrew a manila folder, its edges soft and darkened with handling. She slid it across the glass with a fingertip. "My son Derek drew these," she said, "2 weeks before he disappeared. He was a good boy, Mr. Caldwell. He was going to community college for graphic design. He didn't believe in any of this nonsense. He laughed at my Mothman keychains. But 2 weeks before he vanished, he started drawing in a sketchbook I didn't know he owned. I found it under his mattress when I was changing the sheets." Owen opened the folder. The drawings inside were not the obsessive architectural studies of his father's journals, but frantic, gestural explosions of charcoal and ink. They depicted the same winged silhouette, but from below, from the perspective of someone looking up in terror. And in each drawing, the eyes were not merely red but emitted beams of light that struck the viewer, struck Derek, and seemed to pin him to the ground like an insect under a magnifying glass. In the margins, in handwriting that deteriorated from loose to jagged, Derek had written questions that read like prayers. "What does it see when it looks at me? Why do I see the water? Why do I see myself in the water?" Owen felt his throat tighten. He had seen himself in the water too, standing on the bank, watching the bridge fall. "There were 7 others before Patricia and Derek," Alina said quietly. 7 others in the last 3 months, all from high places, all left behind the same ash. The police say it's just residue from the old foundry, but I was there when they scraped Patricia Hale's ash from her windowsill. It was 4 pounds and 2 ounces. She weighed 118 pounds. You do the math, Mr. Caldwell. You're the engineer." Owen did the math. 4 pounds was roughly 3.5% of a human body's mass. It was the approximate weight of the blood, the brain, the spinal fluid, the liquid components, removed and desiccated. The skeletal structure remained, crushed and collapsed, vacuum-sealed into a smaller space. He thought of the forensic pathologist's description he had read in the newspaper, the clinical observation that the victim's bones had been compressed with a force that exceeded anything a human agent could generate. He thought of the creature's wings, the translucent membranes veined with pulsing filaments, and he imagined them not as instruments of flight, but as conduits of pressure, creating localized vacuums that could extract the essence from a body and leave only the dry husk behind. "The eyes," Owen said, his voice sounding distant even to himself. "Derek wrote about seeing things, future things." Alina nodded, her own eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Owen's shoulder. "They call it the gaze. Everyone who sees the eyes up close, really up close, comes back changed, not physically, mentally, temporally, if that's a word. They see the moment of their death, or the moment of a death, something inevitable, something structural." She paused, her hands knitting together in her lap with a compulsive rhythm. "My sister saw the eyes in 1967. She was 16. She was on the old Silver Bridge when it happened. She survived because she had seen the collapse in a dream 3 nights before, and when the cables started singing that particular note, the note of metal fatiguing beyond its tolerance, she was already running for the Ohio shore. She was the last person off before the deck tilted, but she never slept again, Mr. Caldwell. Not really. She died in 1989 with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and the hospice nurse said her last word was up." Owen sat with this information until the bakery's vanilla scent became cloying, until the fluorescent buzz resolved into the creature's hum, and he could no longer distinguish between the two. He thanked Alina and left the folder on the counter, though the images of Derek's drawings seemed to have been burned into his retinas, superimposing themselves over the street outside when he blinked. He walked to the hardware store, to the alley beneath Patricia Hale's window, and stood looking up at the scored sill. The gouges were 4 parallel lines, spaced like fingers, but the spacing was wrong for a human hand. The wood had been compressed rather than cut, as though tremendous force had been applied through soft tissue rather than claw. He touched the marks with his fingertips and felt, impossibly, a faint residual warmth, as though whatever had made them had done so recently. The sky above the alley was a flat gray, the color of unwashed concrete, and Owen found himself unable to look directly at it, his neck muscles locking in a spasm of involuntary caution. That night he returned to his father's study and began a systematic review of the journals, no longer reading for narrative but for data. He charted the sightings, the disappearances, the structural failures. He noted that every major Mothman cluster in the historical record, 1967, 1926, 1901, corresponded with a catastrophic structural collapse within a radius of 5 miles. Not always a bridge. In 1901, it had been the collapse of the coal tipple at the No. 7 mine, burying 40 men. In 1926, the sudden, unexplained implosion of the Presbyterian Church's bell tower during a windless Tuesday morning. The creature did not cause these events. It attended them. It measured them. It selected witnesses and imparted visions of the impending failure with a precision that Owen, in his professional capacity, could only describe as diagnostic. The red eyes were instruments. The gaze was a transmission of structural data, a warning encoded in the only language that could not be ignored, the visual cortex, the seat of certainty. But the warnings were not benevolent. Owen understood this as he cross-referenced his father's sketches with the engineering blueprints of the new Silver Memorial Bridge, which he had downloaded onto his laptop using the house's wheezing dial-up connection. The bridge was sound. Its cables were new. Its pilings were deep. And yet, in his father's final journal, dated 2 days before his death, there was a drawing of the bridge's northern suspension tower with a hairline crack indicated at the exact position of the primary load-bearing rivet. The crack was drawn in red ink, a color his father had never used in his earlier, saner entries. Owen pulled up the bridge's maintenance records, accessed through a backdoor in the state database that he still retained from his consulting days, and felt his blood slow in his veins. An inspection was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The inspector's preliminary notes, logged in a file that had not yet been made public, indicated anomalous vibrational readings in the northern tower. The readings were within tolerance, barely, but they were there. He worked through the night, his father's journals spread in a circle around him like runes, his laptop screen casting a blue glow that made the red eyes in the drawings seem to pulse. The disappearances were accelerating. 3 more in the last week, a roofer in Mason County, a window washer in Gallipolis, a child who had climbed an oak tree and never descended. The ash was always the same, the vertical gouges were always the same, and the survivors, those who had seen the creature but not been taken, were reporting the same symptoms. Headaches that felt like pressure from within. Flashes of vision that arrived without warning, showing them moments of collapse, moments of falling, moments of being crushed beneath tons of concrete and steel. The town was developing a phobia of altitude. People were moving out of second-story apartments. The fire department had responded to 17 calls in the last week from citizens who had become trapped in their own homes, unable to descend staircases, because the view from the landing had triggered a paralytic terror. The sky had become a danger zone. Looking up was an act of suicidal bravado. Owen felt it himself now, a constriction in his chest whenever he passed beneath an open window, a flinch when a cloud passed overhead and cast a shadow that moved too quickly. He had seen the eyes only once directly, at the Silver Bridge ruins, but their afterimage seemed to have burned into his optic nerve, a persistent floaters-like smear of crimson that drifted across his field of vision whenever he shifted his gaze too quickly, and the visions were growing more frequent. He saw the bridge collapse not as a single catastrophic event, but as a cascade of smaller failures, a chain reaction initiated by a microscopic fatigue in a single rivet, propagating through the structure with a speed that seemed almost eager. He saw the cars falling. He saw the river rising to meet them. And increasingly, he saw himself among the victims, not as a passive observer on the bank but as a participant, his hands gripping a steering wheel that had become useless, his mouth open in a scream that was swallowed by the roar of shearing metal. The gaze was not a warning. It was a recruitment. It was pulling him into the event horizon of the disaster, making him complicit in its inevitability. On the 7th day after his arrival in Point Pleasant, Owen drove to the industrial district on the town's eastern edge, where the old textile mill and the warehouse complex stood like rotten teeth against the horizon. The warehouses had been abandoned since the 1980s, their corrugated metal skins rusted to the color of dried blood, their interiors a labyrinth of collapsed shelving and pigeon droppings. He did not know why he was drawn there. Perhaps it was the same gravitational pull that had kept him from driving across the bridge. Perhaps it was something in the journals, a reference his father had made to the warehouses as the convergence point, a place where the lines of structural weakness intersected like fault lines. The sky above the district was darker than it should have been, not with storm clouds but with a quality of light that seemed to have been filtered through smoked glass. And as Owen stepped from his car, he felt the hum return, not as a subsonic vibration, but as a physical pressure against his eardrums, a sensation like descending in an airplane that never landed. He walked through the maze of decaying buildings, his flashlight beam scattering across broken glass and pools of stagnant water that reflected the beam back with an oily sheen. The warehouses had been built in the 1940s, during the wartime boom, and their construction had been rushed, their foundations poured onto unstable alluvial soil that had shifted over the decades like the deck of a ship. Owen could read these weaknesses without instruments. He could see the cracks in the brickwork, the sagging roof lines, the way the floors tilted toward the center of each structure as though funneling whatever fell into them toward a single point. The creature had been here. He knew it with the certainty of a man who recognizes his own handwriting. The gouges in the concrete were fresh, some of them still shedding fine dust into the stagnant air, and there were more of them here than anywhere else in town, not 2 parallel tracks but dozens, crisscrossing the loading docks and the parking lots in a pattern that suggested not solitary hunting but systematic surveying, a grid of inspection. He entered the largest warehouse, a cavernous structure whose roof had partially collapsed in a storm during the Clinton administration, leaving a gaping hole through which the dark sky was visible like the iris of a blind eye. The interior smelled of rust and wet cardboard and something else, something organic and metallic that made Owen's sinuses burn. His flashlight caught the glint of something in the rafters, and he raised the beam, his arm trembling, knowing before the light found its target what he would see. The Mothman was perched on a twisted steel beam 40 feet above the floor, its wings folded tight against its body, its head tilted at that same angle of professional attention that Owen had observed at the bridge. But it was not looking at the roof. It was looking down. It was looking at him. And in the absolute stillness of that moment, Owen felt the gaze lock onto him with a physical force that drove him to his knees. The vision that followed was not of the bridge. It was of this warehouse, this exact structure, and it was not a future possibility but an imminent certainty. He saw the roof beams failing in sequence, not from age but from resonance, from a frequency that matched their harmonic weakness and caused them to shake apart like a wine glass under an opera singer's note. He saw the walls bowing outward and then imploding. He saw the floor collapsing into the basement level, where a forgotten storage tank of industrial solvent waited like a funeral pyre. And he saw the people, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, pouring into the warehouse from the streets outside, driven by the same subsonic hum that had brought Owen here, herded like cattle into a pen whose walls were already crumbling. The Mothman was not going to kill them. It was going to watch them die. It was going to illuminate their destruction with its red eyes and record their final moments with the impassivity of a machine. When the vision released him, Owen was curled on the warehouse floor, his cheek pressed against cold concrete, his flashlight rolling in a slow circle nearby. He looked up at the beam where the creature had been. It was gone, but the hum remained, and it was louder now, oscillating between two frequencies that caused his teeth to ache and his vision to strobe. He stumbled to his feet and ran, not toward the entrance but deeper into the warehouse, toward a section of wall where the brick had crumbled to reveal the ventilation system of the adjacent building, a shaft that his engineer's mind mapped in an instant as a potential escape route. He did not know why he was running inward rather than outward. He only knew that the gaze had shown him something else, something hidden in the geometry of the structure, a flaw that was also a gift, a weakness that created a path through the destruction. He crawled into the shaft, the metal tearing his shirt, the darkness absolute, and as he pulled himself through the intestines of the dying building, he heard the first groan of failing steel behind him. But that was not yet. That was the future, hours or perhaps minutes away, but not yet. For now he was still in the warehouse, still on the floor, still feeling the weight of the red eyes upon him. He realized with a start that felt like waking from anesthesia that he had not moved. The vision had been so complete, so immersive, that his body had remained paralyzed throughout, and the creature was still above him, still watching, still waiting for the structural failure that would turn this place into a tomb. He forced his limbs to move, crawling backward toward the entrance, his eyes never leaving the beam where the red glow pulsed like a heartbeat. The creature did not follow. It simply watched, its head tracking his movement with the smooth precision of a surveillance camera, and Owen understood that it was allowing him to leave. It was granting him a temporary reprieve because he was not yet part of the herd. He was still the witness. He was still the one who would understand what was coming, who would see the pattern and recognize it for what it was, not a warning but a selection process. The Mothman did not appear before disasters to save people. It appeared to identify those who could survive them, to mark them with its gaze and release them back into the population as carriers of a new kind of fear, a fear that would reshape their perception of the world into a topology of impending collapse. Owen reached the entrance and stumbled into the gray afternoon, his lungs burning, his clothes filthy with rust and grease. He did not look back. He drove back to his father's house with the radio turned off, the hum still resonating in his bones, and sat in the darkened study until nightfall, waiting for the convergence he knew was coming. The storm arrived not as a meteorological event, but as a structural one, a system of pressure and torque that Owen could feel in his molars before the first cloud crossed the moon. It began with a silence that seemed to have been vacuum-sealed over the town, a silence in which the usual night sounds, the crickets, the distant barges on the river, the hum of the substation on Mill Road, were not merely absent but negated, as though the acoustic fabric of the world had been inverted. Owen sat in his father's study with the journals arranged in chronological order across the floor, his laptop screen dark, his hands folded in his lap like the hands of a man awaiting execution. The red eyes in the drawings seemed to have grown brighter as the sky outside darkened, and he realized with a slow, creeping horror that it was not the drawings that were changing but his own perception, the afterimage of the gaze having altered his visual processing in ways that were becoming permanent. He could see the stress fractures now, not just in buildings but in everything, the spiderweb cracks in the plaster above his head, the hairline fissures in the window glass, the invisible lines of fatigue that ran through the floorboards like veins in a dying leaf. The world was a machine in the process of throwing a gear, and he was learning to read its death throes as a language. The hum began at 11 minutes past midnight, according to the battery-powered clock on the mantel. It started as a subsonic thrum, below the threshold of hearing, a pressure that caused the coffee in his abandoned mug to vibrate in concentric circles. Then it rose, climbing the scale of frequency with a deliberation that seemed almost pedagogical, as though the creature were tuning an instrument. By 11:30, the sound was audible, a low drone that seemed to emanate from the sky itself rather than from any single point within it. Owen rose from his chair and walked to the window, his legs unsteady, his body responding to the vibration with a nausea that felt like motion sickness without movement. The street outside was empty, but it was not deserted. He could see them in the doorways and the alley mouths, standing in the shadows with their heads tilted upward at identical angles, their faces pale and slack. They were sleepwalking, or rather, they were being walked, pulled from their beds by a summons that operated below consciousness, a magnetic field of dread that reoriented their inner compasses toward the industrial district. The convergence had begun. Owen knew he should hide. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who has studied the mechanics of disaster, that the warehouse was a kill zone, a structure whose failure mode had already been calculated, and whose collapse was not a possibility but a scheduled event. But the gaze had marked him, and the mark was not merely psychological. It was directional, a vector that pulled him toward the event with the same inevitability that gravity pulled water downhill. He put on his father's old barn coat, which smelled of pipe tobacco and mothballs, and stepped out into the street. The air was warm and thick, charged with a static electricity that made his hair stand on end, and his skin prickle with gooseflesh. The sleepwalkers were moving now, a slow procession of figures in night clothes and bathrobes, their feet bare against the asphalt, their eyes open but unfocused, their mouths slightly parted as though receiving instructions on a frequency only their nervous systems could decode. Owen fell in with them, not because he wanted to, but because the alternative, resisting the pull, digging his heels into the pavement, felt physically impossible, as though the air itself had become a medium too dense to move against. They walked in silence for what felt like hours but was probably less than one, a funeral procession without a coffin, winding through the darkened streets toward the eastern edge of town. The hum grew louder with each block, modulating now into a complex chord that contained harmonics Owen could feel in his sternum, his pelvis, the arches of his feet. The sleepwalkers did not stumble. They moved with a coordinated precision that suggested choreography, their steps falling into rhythm with the vibration until the entire group was moving in unison, a single organism with 100 legs. Owen looked at their faces as they passed beneath the intermittent streetlights, and he saw there an expression he recognized from his own reflection in the bathroom mirror, the look of someone who has seen the future and found it immutable. They knew where they were going. They knew what waited there, and they were going anyway because the gaze had shown them that the path was already poured, the concrete already set. The warehouse district loomed ahead, a silhouette of jagged roofs and skeletal water towers against a sky that was not dark but wrong, the color of a bruise that had begun to heal, purple and yellow and green in overlapping layers. The hum was a physical presence here, a wall of sound that pressed against Owen's eardrums with a force that threatened to rupture them. The sleepwalkers were not slowing. They moved past the chain-link fence that surrounded the complex. The gate had been torn from its hinges, the metal twisted into spirals that suggested not force but resonance, as though the gate had vibrated apart at its molecular bonds, and filed into the largest warehouse, the one with the gaping hole in its roof. Owen hesitated at the threshold. The interior was lit by a sourceless red glow, the color of darkroom safe lights, and the air inside moved in currents that were warm and carried the scent of ozone and copper. He could see the sleepwalkers arranging themselves in rows on the warehouse floor, standing with their arms at their sides, their faces upturned toward the hole in the roof, their postures suggesting not prayer but submission, a voluntary yielding to an inspection. Owen stepped inside. The door did not close behind him because there was no door, only a frame where the metal had been peeled back like the skin of a fruit. The warehouse floor was concrete, cracked and stained with decades of oil and rust, and the cracks had widened since his visit earlier that day. They were no longer hairline fractures but gaps wide enough to insert a finger, and through them Owen could feel a rising heat, as though the earth beneath the building were preparing to exhale. The sleepwalkers. There were perhaps 50 of them now, though more were entering in a steady stream, stood in their rows without speaking, without weeping, without any sign of the panic that should have been the natural response to their situation. The panic had already been extracted from them, Owen realized. The gaze had visited them in their dreams, had shown them the collapse and their place within it, and had left behind only a resigned acceptance that was indistinguishable from catatonia. They were waiting for the test to begin. The creature was already there. Owen saw it as soon as he looked up, though looking up was an act of will that required him to override every survival instinct his body possessed. It was perched on a beam that ran the length of the warehouse roof, its wings fully extended now, their spans so vast that they seemed to generate their own weather system, stirring the air below into currents that tugged at Owen's coat and whipped his hair across his face. The red eyes were not merely glowing but projecting, casting beams of crimson light that swept across the assembled crowd like searchlights, touching each face in turn, lingering for a moment, moving on. Where the light touched, the sleepwalkers stiffened, their backs arching, their mouths opening in silent screams that produced no sound because the hum had swallowed all acoustic competition. Owen watched as a woman in a nightgown, she looked like Eleanor Vance, though he could not be certain at this distance and in this light, received her portion of the gaze and began to convulse, her body shaking with a violence that suggested electrocution, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. When the beam moved on, she collapsed onto the concrete, twitching, and did not rise again. She had failed the test, or perhaps she had passed it. Owen could not tell. He pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat, his vision strobing with the same frequency as the creature's wing beats. The red beam swept past him, not touching him, and he understood that he was being spared for the moment not because of mercy but because of category. He was not part of the herd. He was the observer, the control group, the one who would survive to document the results. The creature was herding the population into the kill zone, yes, but it was also performing a selection, using the collapse as a filter to separate the strong from the weak, the quick from the slow, those who could navigate the geometry of destruction from those who would be crushed by it. The Mothman was not merely a harbinger. It was a curator of catastrophe, a biological event inextricable from the disasters it attended, and the red eyes were its instruments of appraisal. The storm broke, not with rain but with sound. The creature threw back its head and opened its mouth, and the scream that issued from it was not a biological cry but a structural one, a note so pure and so powerful that it seemed to bypass the ears entirely and strike the bones of the inner ear with the force of a hammer. The scream climbed in pitch, finding a resonance with the steel beams of the warehouse, and Owen felt the floor beneath his feet begin to vibrate in sympathy. The sleepwalkers, those who were still standing, staggered as the concrete rippled like water, their rows breaking apart into confusion. The scream climbed higher, and now Owen could see the beams themselves beginning to sing, a harmonic overtone that matched the creature's cry note for note, and he understood with a clarity that felt like falling that the Mothman was not merely witnessing the collapse. It was causing it. It was using its voice as a tuning fork, striking the resonant frequency of the warehouse's structural weakness, and the building was responding, beginning to shake apart with an eagerness that suggested gratitude. The first beam fell at the northern end of the warehouse, a twisted I-beam that had supported the roof for 60 years, snapping now like a dry twig under the pressure of the harmonic assault. It struck the floor with a sound like a bomb detonating, and the concrete cratered beneath it, sending up a cloud of dust that glowed red in the creature's light. The sleepwalkers screamed then, a mass scream that rose above even the hum and the creature's cry, and they began to run. But there was nowhere to run. The warehouse had only two exits. The door through which they had entered, which was now blocked by a collapsing section of roof, and a loading dock on the southern side that was visible only as a rectangle of lesser darkness in the dust-choked gloom. The creature circled above them, its wingbeats stirring the debris into a cyclone of rust and glass and splintered wood, its red eyes sweeping the chaos with a dispassion that was more terrible than rage would have been. It was not angry. It was not hungry. It was simply conducting an experiment, and the subjects were failing it in real time. Owen ran. He did not run toward the loading dock, which was already choked with oppressive bodies that would crush each other in their panic. He ran inward, toward the center of the warehouse, where the floor was cracking open like a dried lake bed, because the vision the creature had granted him earlier had shown him something hidden in the collapse, a path through the destruction that only an engineer could see. The ventilation shaft. The flaw that was also a gift. He had seen it in the vision, a structural discontinuity where the original builders had joined the warehouse to an adjacent building, creating a gap in the load-bearing walls that was normally hidden behind a false panel. If he could reach it before the floor gave way, if he could crawl through the shaft before the building pancaked, he might emerge on the other side of the complex, outside the perimeter of the collapse. The floor tilted beneath him and he fell, his palms slapping against concrete that was already breaking into irregular plates. A sleepwalker, a man in boxer shorts and a torn t-shirt, stumbled past him, his face bloody from a glancing blow by falling debris, his eyes wide and unseeing. Owen grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the gap in the wall, but the man yanked free with a strength born of animal terror and ran toward the loading dock, where a section of roof had just fallen, crushing 3 people beneath a slab of corrugated metal the size of a garage door. Owen did not watch. He could not watch. He scrambled across the tilting floor, his fingers finding purchase in the cracks, his boots skidding on dust that had become a lubricant. The creature swooped low, its wingtip passing not 2 feet above his head, and the wind of its passage knocked him flat, driving the air from his lungs. He rolled onto his back, gasping, and saw the red eyes directly above him, filling his vision, and for a moment he felt the pull of the gaze, the seductive promise of knowledge, the vision of his own death that waited like a gift behind those luminous spheres. But he turned his head. He wrenched his face away from the light, pressing his cheek against the cold concrete, and the vision shattered, incomplete, leaving behind only a lingering afterimage of falling steel, and his own hands reaching upward in a gesture that might have been supplication or might have been surrender. The creature did not stop. It did not return to finish the transmission. It simply continued its orbit, rising toward the roof with a speed that defied gravity, and Owen understood that his resistance had been noted, catalogued, filed away for future reference. He was not prey. He was data. He reached the false panel. It had fallen inward, revealing the ventilation shaft as the vision had promised, a square tunnel of galvanized steel that ran at a slight upward angle into the adjacent structure. The adjacent building was smaller, a 2-story office block that had been built on more stable ground, and it had not yet begun to collapse, though he could hear the walls groaning in sympathy with the warehouse's death throes. He pulled himself into the shaft, the metal tearing his palms, his shoulders scraping against the sides. Behind him, the warehouse was screaming. Not the creature, the building itself, a structural scream of shearing rivets and snapping rebar and concrete failing in compression. The sleepwalkers were screaming too, those who still could, and the sounds of their deaths were not the prolonged agony of a slasher film, but the quick, wet, clinical sounds of physics asserting its dominance over biology. A body struck by a falling beam did not cry out for long. A skull crushed by a concrete slab produced a sound like a melon dropped from a height, a single catastrophic note that ended all further acoustic contribution from that source. Owen crawled. The shaft was hot, heated by the friction of the building's collapse, and the air inside was thick with dust that coated his throat and lungs. He crawled on his belly, his elbows bleeding, his knees shredded through his jeans, pulling himself forward by his fingertips because there was no room to turn around, no room to go back, only the narrow tunnel and the distant rectangle of lesser darkness that marked the far end. The sounds of the warehouse followed him, modulated by the metal walls into a bass rumble that felt like being inside a whale's heart. He could hear the creature too, not as a scream now, but as a low, rhythmic pulse, the beat of its wings generating pressure waves that traveled through the shaft and pressed against his eardrums in a massage that threatened to burst them. He crawled faster, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision narrowing to a tunnel that matched the one his body was traversing. The shaft ended. He tumbled out into a small mechanical room on the second floor of the office building, landing on a rusted boiler that rang like a bell beneath his weight. The room was dark, lit only by the red glow that filtered through a cracked window, and Owen lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, his body shaking with a combination of exertion and delayed terror that felt like hypothermia. Through the window, he could see the warehouse. It was folding in on itself, not collapsing in a single catastrophic moment but failing in stages, each floor punching through the one below it in a sequence that looked almost balletic from this distance, a choreography of destruction that the creature was conducting from above. The Mothman circled the dying building, its wings spread wide, its red eyes sweeping the rubble with a thoroughness that suggested it was counting the bodies, verifying the results of its experiment. Owen forced himself to stand. The mechanical room had a door that led to a staircase, and the staircase led to a side exit that opened onto an alley. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who has been injured and does not yet know the extent of his wounds, his hand finding the railing, his feet testing each step before committing his weight. The office building was shaking now, the walls transmitting the vibrations from the warehouse collapse, and Owen knew that it too would fail eventually, that the destruction would propagate through the complex like a neural impulse through a dying brain. He reached the ground floor and found the side exit, a metal door with a push bar that was hot to the touch. He threw his weight against it and stumbled out into the night. The rain was falling now, a warm, thick rain that smelled of sulfur and iron. Owen stood in the alley, his face turned upward, his mouth open, letting the water wash the dust from his tongue. The warehouse was behind him, a roar of falling steel and concrete that filled the night like a physical presence, and above it circled the creature, a silhouette against the bruised sky, its red eyes pulsing like a lighthouse warning ships away from a reef. But the warning was too late. The ships were already sinking. He walked. He did not run because his legs would not permit it, but he walked with a determination that was indistinguishable from flight, following the alley to the street to the highway to the bridge. The new bridge, the silver memorial bridge. He would cross it. He would leave this town and never return. He would drive until he ran out of gas, and then he would walk, carrying the weight of what he had seen like a tumor in his chest, incommunicable and inoperable. The bridge loomed ahead, its suspension cables humming in the wind, its lights casting a yellow path across the dark water. Owen stepped onto the pedestrian walkway, his hand finding the cold steel of the railing, and he felt the vibration in the metal, the same frequency he had felt in the warehouse, the same harmonic that presaged failure. He looked up. The creature was perched on the northern suspension tower, its wings folded, its body as still as a gargoyle. The red eyes were looking down at him, not with aggression but with an expression that Owen could only interpret as appraisal, as acknowledgement. The bridge would fall. He knew it now, with a certainty that transcended engineering and entered the realm of prophecy. Not tonight, perhaps. Not this year, perhaps. But eventually, inevitably, the crack in the northern tower would propagate, The rivet would shear, the cable would part, and the cars would slide into the river. And the creature would be there to watch, to illuminate the descent with its red gaze, to select the survivors and mark them with the same knowledge that was now burning behind Owen's own eyes. He walked across the bridge. The creature did not follow. It simply watched, a sentinel against the sky, a harbinger that had already delivered its message. On the Ohio shore, Owen turned and looked back. Point Pleasant was burning, not with fire but with dust, a column of pulverized concrete rising into the clouds like a signal, and within that column the red eyes pulsed, measuring, waiting, calculating the next failure. Owen knew that he would never be free of them. He would see them in his dreams, in his peripheral vision, in the brake lights of the cars that passed him on the highway. He would see them glowing over other people, marking them as marked, selecting them for the disasters that were already moving toward them through the invisible structure of time. The gaze had shown him the future, and the future was a landscape of collapsing buildings and falling bridges and red eyes that watched from the ruins with the patience of something that had never learned the meaning of mercy. He got into his car, which he had left parked at the Ohio end of the bridge, and drove west. The radio was silent. The sky was empty. But in the rearview mirror, for just a moment, he saw 2 points of red light that did not fade with distance, that maintained their size and their intensity no matter how fast he drove or how far he went. The Mothman was not watching him anymore. It was watching through him. And somewhere in Point Pleasant, in the rubble of the warehouse, the survivors who had crawled from the wreckage were looking up at the sky with new eyes, seeing the stress fractures in the world, waiting for the next scream that would signal the next collapse. The convergence was complete. The selection had been made, and the red gaze, once seen, could never be unseen. Owen did not stop driving until the fuel gauge kissed empty somewhere outside of Cincinnati, the needle trembling against the E with a persistence that felt like accusation. He pulled into a truck stop whose neon sign buzzed with a frequency that made his teeth ache, and he sat in the idling car for 11 minutes before he remembered how to turn off the ignition. The gas station attendant, a young man with acne-scarred cheeks and a name tag that read DARRELL, tapped on the window and asked if he was okay. Owen looked at him and saw, hovering over Darrell's left shoulder like a halo viewed through infrared, a faint red luminescence. It was not bright. It was not the full, hypnotic glow of the creature's eyes, but it was unmistakably the same color, the same texture of light, and it pulsed in rhythm with Darrell's heartbeat, which Owen could somehow hear, or perhaps only imagine he heard, a wet thumping that seemed to emanate from the boy's jugular. Owen said he was fine. He said it in a voice that sounded like it had been dragged across broken concrete. He pumped the gas himself, his hands shaking so badly that he spilled $2 worth of unleaded onto his boots, and when he went inside to pay, he saw that the red glow was not limited to Darrell. It was above the woman buying lottery tickets by the coffee machine. It was above the trucker arguing with the microwave about his burrito. It was faint, attenuated, a residue of the gaze that had infected Owen's perception, but it was there, and it meant something. It meant that these people were marked. It meant that the structure of their lives contained a hidden flaw, a stress fracture that would eventually propagate, and the Mothman, or whatever the Mothman represented, had already calculated their failure modes and scheduled their collapses. He drove to a motel on the outskirts of the city, a brick structure built in the 1970s that advertised color television and vibrating beds with a sign whose paint had peeled to the point of abstraction. The clerk took his cash without looking up from a portable television showing a sitcom laugh track, and Owen was grateful for this because he did not think he could survive another human looking him in the eye. The room was number 117, at the end of a corridor that smelled of mildew and industrial disinfectant. He locked the door, slid the chain, pushed the bureau against it, and sat on the edge of the bed with his hands folded between his knees, staring at the brown carpet until dawn. He did not sleep. Sleep had become a theoretical state, something that other people did, like vacationing or believing in God. When the sun rose, it did so through a window that faced a highway overpass, and Owen watched the morning traffic with a fascination that bordered on religious awe. Each car was a load-bearing element in a larger structure, each driver a rivet whose sheer strength had not yet been tested. And above them, invisible to everyone except Owen, the red glow hovered in a constellation of impending doom, a sky map of catastrophes waiting to be born. He stayed in the motel for 3 days, living on vending machine peanuts and tap water, leaving the room only to use the bathroom at the end of the hall, because the one in his room had a shower stall whose grout lines showed cracks that he could not bear to examine too closely. On the 4th day, he turned on the television and saw Point Pleasant on the national news. The warehouse collapse had been attributed to a gas leak, a tragic accident, a structural failure caused by decades of deferred maintenance. The death toll was 63. The bodies were being recovered slowly, hampered by the instability of the remaining structures. The governor had declared a state of emergency, and in the background of the news footage, visible only to Owen because he knew where to look, the creature was perched on a water tower, its wings folded, its red eyes glowing like embers in the gray light of a rainy afternoon. The news anchor did not mention it. The camera operator did not zoom in. It was simply there, a sentinel marking the boundary between the disaster and the next disaster, and Owen understood that its presence in the frame was not an accident. It was a message. It was a letter addressed specifically to him. He threw the remote at the television, shattering the screen into a spiderweb of plasma and glass. The screen bled black, and in the reflection of the dark glass, Owen saw his own face, and he saw that his eyes were not right. The pupils were too large, dilated to a degree that swallowed the iris, and in their depths, if he looked closely, if he looked with the new perception the gaze had granted him, he could see 2 tiny points of red light, inverted as though the creature were looking out from inside his skull. He ran to the bathroom and vomited into the cracked toilet, his body purging itself of a horror that had no physical correlate, and when he looked up at the mirror, the red points were still there, smaller now, dimmer but present. Permanent. He had not escaped the warehouse. He had carried it with him, a structural flaw in his own biology, and the creature had moved in like a squatter, occupying the space behind his eyes where certainty used to live. On the 5th day, he drove back. Not to Point Pleasant. He could not have borne to return there to see the crater where the warehouse had stood, to smell the ash that still drifted on the wind, but to a town 30 miles north, a place called Henderson, where he rented a room above a hardware store and tried to reconstruct his life with the materials at hand. He found work as a draftsman for a small construction firm, a position that did not require a license and paid in cash. He ate dinner at a diner where the waitress called him honey and never asked why he always sat with his back to the window. He lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror that had become so familiar it felt like normalcy, the way a man with chronic pain eventually stops noticing the ache and only registers its absence as strange. And everywhere he looked, he saw the red glow. It was not above everyone. That was the mercy, if mercy was the word. It appeared only above certain people, at certain times, and Owen began to track it with the same obsessive precision his father had used to track the creature. He kept a journal, not his father's journals, which he had left in the burning warehouse in his imagination, but a new one, a spiral-bound notebook from the dollar store, in which he recorded the names and faces of the marked. There was the mailman whose red glow flared brightest on Tuesdays, suggesting a temporal component to the marking. There was the little girl in the apartment across the street whose glow had appeared suddenly one morning and vanished 3 days later, suggesting either a false positive or a reprieve that Owen could not explain. There was the owner of the hardware store, Mr. Castellanos, whose glow had been present since Owen's arrival, and who had, just last week, been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, the news arriving with a structural inevitability that made Owen want to scream. The glow was not a cause. It was a symptom. It was the visible manifestation of a hidden weakness, the way a crack in a wall is the visible manifestation of a failing foundation, and Owen was the only one who could see it. He tried to warn them. He told Mr. Castellanos to get a second opinion, to see a specialist in Columbus, to do anything but accept the diagnosis as final. The old man had looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion, the look of a man being addressed by a prophet on a street corner, and had thanked him and done nothing. The mailman, when Owen suggested he take a different route on Tuesdays, one that avoided the intersection of Maple and 3rd, had laughed and said Owen sounded like his grandmother with her horoscope. The little girl's mother had threatened to call the police when Owen knocked on her door and asked if her daughter had been sleeping okay, if she had been seeing things, if she had looked up at the sky and seen something looking back. No one believed him. No one could believe him, because the evidence was not in the world but in his optic nerve, a mutation caused by the gaze that had rewired his visual cortex into a receiver for a frequency that no human instrument could detect. And then, one evening in late October, Owen saw the glow above himself. He was shaving in the bathroom mirror, the cheap fluorescent fixture buzzing its insect song, and he looked up from the razor to find the red halo hovering over his own reflection, pulsing in time with his heartbeat, its color deeper and more saturated than any he had seen before. He dropped the razor. It clattered into the sink, and the sound of it snapping against the porcelain was the sound of a structural element failing, a rivet shearing, a cable parting under load. He stared at the glow, at his own eyes within the glow, and he saw the vision that the creature had denied him in the warehouse, the vision of his death that he had turned away from at the last moment. It was not the bridge. It was not the warehouse. It was a smaller collapse, a private failure, a moment in a future that might be weeks or months or years away, when he would be standing on a fire escape in some city he did not yet know, looking up at a sky that was empty except for 2 red eyes, and the fire escape would groan, and the bolts would shear, and he would fall. Not far, not dramatically, just enough to break his neck against the dumpster below, enough to end his measurement of the world's weaknesses with a weakness of his own. He did not look away from the vision. He held it, studied it, mapped its stress fractures with the same professional attention he had once applied to bridges and high-rises. And when it finally faded, leaving him gripping the sink with white knuckles and a face half covered in shaving cream, he understood at last what his father had understood in the final days of his life. The gaze was a gift. It was the mercy of knowing. It was the preparation that allowed a man to meet his end not with surprise but with recognition, to greet the falling beam or the shearing cable or the failing rivet with a nod of professional respect, acknowledging that the structure had held as long as it could, and that its collapse was not a tragedy but a completion. Owen moved to Columbus in November. He found a job reviewing building plans for a mid-sized engineering firm that did not ask too many questions about his missing license. He lived in a basement apartment whose ceiling was low and whose walls were thick, a bunker against the sky. He stopped looking up. He stopped recording the glow in his journal. He tried, with a determination that felt like self-mutilation, to forget the creature, to forget Point Pleasant, to forget the warehouse and the sleepwalkers, and the sound of the Mothman's scream triggering the resonance that had killed 63 people. But forgetting was impossible, because the red glow was everywhere, and it was growing brighter. He saw it above the project manager at the engineering firm, a man named Haverson who drove a BMW and talked about his golf handicap with the fervor of a convert. Haverson died 3 months later in a parking garage collapse in Dayton, crushed beneath 3 levels of concrete because the contractor had used substandard rebar. Owen had seen the glow above him and had said nothing, because he had learned that saying nothing was the only way to survive, that the creature's gift was also its curse, a knowledge that isolated the bearer from the rest of humanity more completely than any prison cell. He saw the glow above a woman on the bus, a teenager in the library, a priest in the park. Each time he recorded it in his mind, noting the date, the intensity, the eventual outcome. He became, without intending it, a census-taker of catastrophe, a bureaucrat of doom, and the weight of this role settled onto his shoulders like a yoke. And always in his peripheral vision, the creature waited. Not close enough to touch, not close enough to trigger the full force of the gaze, but present, a static silhouette on a distant roofline, a pair of red eyes in the reflection of a darkened window, a shadow that moved against the wind. It was not hunting him. It was studying him, monitoring his adaptation to the gift, noting how his perception had evolved, how his ability to read the structural failures of the world had sharpened into something that approached its own methodology. The Mothman was a peer now, in some terrible sense. It had tested him in the warehouse, had herded him through the collapse, had watched him crawl through the ventilation shaft with the approval of a professor observing a promising student. And now it was waiting for him to complete his education, to accept the logic of the gaze and integrate it into his daily life, until he became not a victim of the creature but an extension of it, a human instrument for measuring the fatigue of the world. One night, in the spring of the following year, Owen woke to find the red glow filling his apartment. Not hovering above him but emanating from him, flooding the room with a crimson luminescence that turned the water stains on the ceiling into maps of arterial blood flow, that made the cracks in the plaster glow like rivers on a topographical survey. He sat up in bed, his heart rate strangely steady, and looked at his hands. They were translucent in the red light, the bones visible beneath the skin, the joints articulated with a clarity that suggested X-ray vision. And in the bones, in the marrow, he saw the same stress fractures he had seen in bridges and buildings, the same hairline weaknesses that presaged collapse. His own skeleton was failing. His own structure was unsound. The creature had not marked him for an external disaster but for an internal one, a failure of the load-bearing elements of his own body, and the glow was the diagnostic reading, the red ink on the blueprint. He got out of bed and walked to the window. The street below was empty, but the sky was not. The creature was there, closer than it had ever been, perched on the telephone pole across the street with its wings folded and its head tilted at that same angle of professional attention. It did not scream. It did not swoop. It simply stared, and Owen stared back, and for the first time since the warehouse he did not turn away. He received the gaze fully, completely, without resistance, and the vision that came was not of his death but of his function. He saw himself standing in a landscape of ruins, a city of collapsed towers and buckled highways, and he was moving through the wreckage with a clipboard and a pen, noting the points of failure, marking the red circles on the blueprints of destruction. He was not a survivor anymore. He was an assessor. He was the creature's colleague, the human partner in a collaboration that spanned decades, centuries perhaps, a symbiosis between the watcher and the witness that ensured the disasters would never go unobserved, that every collapse would be documented and filed and understood. The vision released him, and Owen found himself standing naked at the window, the spring air cold against his skin, the telephone pole empty. The creature was gone, but the red glow remained, no longer emanating from him but hovering above him, a permanent halo that marked him as known, as catalogued, as claimed. He returned to bed and slept for the first time in months, a sleep without dreams, a black and dreamless sleep that felt like the bottom of a deep foundation. He woke to the sound of sirens. A bridge had collapsed in the northern part of the city, a small pedestrian bridge over a drainage canal, poorly maintained, scheduled for repair in the next fiscal year. 2 people had died. Owen listened to the sirens with his eyes closed, his hands folded on his chest, and he did not need to see the news to know that the creature would be there, perched on a nearby pylon, its red eyes sweeping the scene with the satisfaction of a job well observed. He got up, dressed in his work clothes, and went to the office. On the bus, he sat next to a young woman whose glow was particularly bright, a pulsing crimson that suggested an imminent failure, and he looked at her for a long moment, noting the structural weaknesses in her posture, the fatigue in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled as she scrolled through her phone. He did not warn her. He had learned that warnings were not part of the protocol. The protocol was observation, documentation, and acceptance. At his desk, he pulled up the blueprints for a new high-rise that was going up downtown, a glass and steel monument to corporate ego that was being constructed on a foundation that his enhanced perception immediately identified as inadequate. The soil reports were optimistic. The load calculations were within tolerance. But Owen could see the hairline crack in the central pilings, the microscopic deviation in the angle of the support beams, the fatigue that would accumulate over 10 years, 20 years, until the structure surrendered to gravity with the same inevitability that all structures eventually surrendered. He marked the flaw on his screen with a red circle, the color matching the glow above his own head, and he filed the report with a recommendation for additional reinforcement that he knew would be ignored because it was too expensive, because the developer was on a deadline, because the structure of human ambition always overrode the warnings of engineers. He saved the file and looked out the window. The sky was the color of a healing bruise, purple and yellow and green, and against it, invisible to everyone in the office but him, the creature circled in a slow, patient orbit, its wings stirring the clouds, its red eyes pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Owen smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who has finally understood the joke, who has realized that the punchline was written into the blueprint from the beginning. He was not the hero of this story. He was not the victim. He was the witness, the assessor, the peer who had survived the test and been granted the terrible gift of knowing. And the knowing would continue, building upon itself like interest on a debt, until the day when his own structure finally failed and he looked up to see the red eyes waiting to receive him, not as prey but as a colleague, a fellow measurer of the world's endless, beautiful, pitiless collapse. Outside, the sun broke through the bruised sky, and the red glow faded into the daylight, invisible but present, permanent but patient. Owen turned back to his work, his pen moving across the page with the steady precision of a man who has learned to love the thing he fears, and somewhere in the distance, too faint for any ear but his, the hum began again, tuning the instrument, preparing the next note, herding the next convergence toward its inevitable, structural, glorious end. The Screaming Sands. The hand-drawn map had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had begun to tear along the edges, creating pale lines of weakness in the heavy parchment that threatened to split the document into fragments at the slightest careless touch. John Mercer held it up against the dusty afternoon light filtering through the windshield of the battered Ford Explorer, his pale blue eyes tracking the red circles that dotted the interior of the Pine Barrens like lesions on otherwise healthy skin, each one marking a location where something had gone terribly wrong in the 100 square miles of wilderness that stretched before them like an ocean of desolation. The circles had been drawn in a shaking hand, the ink feathering outward in ragged tendrils that suggested the cartographer had not possessed the steady nerves required for accurate survey work. And John knew precisely why those hands had trembled, because he had spent the last 18 months of his disgraced existence studying the reports, the police photographs, the medical examiner's notes, and the eyewitness accounts that constituted the thin but horrifying paper trail of what the locals simply called the mother's curse, a term they uttered in lowered voices, while making the sign of the cross or touching the small medallions that hung around their necks, never willing to speak the true name of the thing that haunted the white sands and skeletal cedar groves of southern New Jersey's most forsaken landscape. He lowered the map and turned to look at the 4 other occupants of the vehicle, his face set in the rigid mask of scientific detachment that he had cultivated over 20 years of biological fieldwork before a single drunken press conference had destroyed his career at Rutgers, reduced him from a respected researcher to a laughingstock, and driven him to the desperate gambit of leading amateur cryptid hunters into restricted wilderness, in search of a creature that conventional science insisted could not exist. The explorer groaned as it climbed over a ridge of sugar sand that had spilled across the unmarked fire road, the tires struggling for purchase against the pale grains that seemed almost luminous in the flat afternoon light. And John felt the familiar thrill of transgression that had defined his professional life since the debacle of his last peer-reviewed paper. The intoxicating sense that he was trespassing against the boundaries of acceptable knowledge, venturing into territory where credentialed scientists feared to tread, because the implications of what they might find would unravel the comfortable certainties upon which their careers and self-images depended. Beside him in the passenger seat, Lena Torres adjusted the settings on her digital audio recorder, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years documenting the acoustic properties of remote environments. Her dark eyes scanning the tree line with the wary alertness of a woman who had grown up in the projects of Camden and knew intimately that danger did not announce itself with cinematic music, but rather arrived in silence, in the sudden absence of expected sounds, in the stillness that preceded violence. She had come on this expedition not because she believed in John's theories about relict populations of prehistoric mammals surviving into the Holocene epoch, but because she needed the money he had promised her from the crowdfunding campaign that had financed their equipment, and because some restless instinct told her that the white wastes of the Barrens held secrets that transcended the petty concerns of academic respectability. In the back seat, Marcus Webb checked the charge on his drone controller for the third time in as many minutes, his broad forehead creased with concentration as he toggled through the diagnostic menus, his habit of constant verification stemming from a childhood spent repairing electronics in his father's small appliance shop in Trenton, and developing an abiding distrust of any technology that he had not personally validated. He was the group's photographer and aerial survey specialist, a man who trusted the objective eye of his camera more than the fallible perceptions of human witnesses, and he had agreed to this expedition because John had shown him a photograph of a footprint cast taken near the Mullica River that defied explanation, a three-toed impression with splayed digits and evidence of a calcaneal spur that suggested a bipedal creature weighing at least 200 pounds. Next to Marcus sat Rebecca Holloway, the youngest member of the expedition at 24, her face partially obscured by the hood of a sweatshirt that bore the logo of a podcast called Beyond the Veil that she produced from a cramped studio apartment in Philadelphia, her fingers dancing across the screen of her tablet as she composed social media updates that she would not be able to transmit until they returned to cellular range. She was the expedition's documentarian and public face, the reason they had been able to raise the $40,000 that had purchased their thermal imaging equipment, their night vision optics, and the ruggedized laptops that stored their research database. And she viewed this trip not merely as an adventure, but as content, as material that would drive subscriptions and patron donations, and perhaps elevate her from a minor figure in the crowded ecosystem of paranormal entertainment to something approaching mainstream recognition. She believed absolutely in the reality of cryptid phenomena, not from any rigorous examination of evidence, but from the romantic conviction that the world was more mysterious and terrible than the materialists admitted. And she had badgered John for months with emails and direct messages, until he had finally relented and allowed her to join the team. Beside Rebecca, occupying the rear passenger seat with his long legs folded awkwardly against the door, was David Chen, a structural engineer who had spent 5 years working for the State Department of Transportation before a climbing accident had shattered his left femur and left him with a titanium rod in his thigh and a permanent limp that made hiking difficult but did not diminish his passion for the wilderness. David had no particular interest in cryptids, but possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the Pine Barrens geography, hydrology, and human history, and he served as the group's navigator and survival expert, the person who knew which berries were safe to eat and how to purify water from the acidic streams that meandered through the lowlands. And he had agreed to join because John's proposed route traversed an area of the Barrens that had been closed to public access since a series of unexplained disappearances in the 1980s, and David was constitutionally incapable of resisting the temptation of forbidden knowledge. The fire road terminated at a rusted gate that had been secured with a chain and padlock sometime in the previous decade, the metal corroded by the salt that blew inland from the Atlantic 20 miles to the east, and John killed the engine and stepped out into air that tasted of pine resin and something else. Something older and less pleasant that he could not immediately identify, but which raised the fine hairs on the back of his neck in an involuntary response that his rational mind dismissed as the product of expectation and suggestion. The silence struck him first, a silence so profound that it seemed to press against his eardrums with physical weight, not the peaceful quiet of a healthy forest, but rather the oppressive stillness of a place where the normal processes of life had been interrupted, where the insects had ceased their droning, and the birds had abandoned their territories, and even the wind seemed to move more cautiously through the canopy, as if fearful of drawing attention to itself. He had read about this phenomenon in the accounts of the survivors, this unnatural hush that descended upon certain areas of the Barrens without warning or obvious cause, and he had attributed it to the collective anxiety of unreliable narrators until this moment when he stood beside the chained gate and felt the silence enter his chest like a cold hand closing around his heart. "No birds," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper, and John nodded because he had noticed it too, the absence of the Carolina wrens and the pine warblers and the red-winged blackbirds that should have been filling the afternoon with their territorial songs, the empty sky above the ghost forest of dead Atlantic white cedars that stretched before them like the ossified remains of some vast marine creature stranded by a receding tide. David limped to the gate and examined the chain with his fingers, tracing the rust patterns with a professional's eye for material failure, and he announced that the padlock had been opened and reclosed within the last month, the metal on the hasp showing fresh scratches where a key or a pick had engaged the mechanism, which meant that someone had recently passed this way and had taken care to conceal their passage from casual observation. They shouldered their packs and climbed over the gate, the metal bars groaning under their weight, and began the long trek into the interior of the restricted zone, their boots sinking into the white sand that comprised the surface geology of much of the Pine Barrens, a deposit of ancient marine sediment that had been deposited during the Miocene epoch when this land had lain beneath the warm waters of a shallow sea, and which now shifted and slid beneath their feet with each step in a manner that made walking exhausting and balance uncertain. John led the way with the map held in his left hand and a GPS unit in his right, though he knew that the dense canopy and the peculiar electromagnetic properties of the underlying iron deposits would eventually degrade satellite reception and force them to navigate by dead reckoning, a prospect that filled him with a mixture of dread and exhilaration, because the loss of technological mediation would strip away the illusion of control and leave them exposed to whatever waited in the spectral groves ahead. The ghost forest materialized around them gradually, the living pines and scrub oaks giving way to stands of dead cedar that had succumbed to some blight or environmental stress decades earlier, their bleached trunks rising from the sand like the ribs of a half-buried leviathan, their branches stripped of bark and polished silver by decades of wind and sand abrasion, until they gleamed in the slanting light with an organic luminescence that seemed almost intentional, as if the trees had been deliberately arranged to create a visual effect of desolation and mourning. The white sand reflected the sunlight upward, creating a disorienting absence of shadow that made depth perception difficult and caused headaches within the first hour of hiking, a phenomenon that Rebecca documented with breathless excitement on her tablet, while David monitored the group's hydration with the grim persistence of a man who understood that heat exhaustion in this environment would mean death before rescue could arrive. They made camp in a clearing that David identified as the remnant of a 19th-century bog iron furnace, the ground littered with slag and fragments of fire brick that crunched beneath their boots like brittle bones. And John unfolded the map again, while the others erected their tents and established the perimeter of their base camp with the methodical efficiency of people who had watched enough survival programming to understand the basic principles of outdoor living. The red circles on the map corresponded to a series of locations that shared certain characteristics. They were all within 3 miles of standing water, they all occurred in areas of dense cedar growth, and they had all been sites of unexplained livestock deaths or human disappearances over the past century, clustering in time around the new moon when darkness was absolute, and the barrens became a landscape of pure negation, a place where the boundary between the visible and the invisible wore thin. John had constructed a theory from these data points, a hypothesis that the creature he sought was not a supernatural demon, but a relict species of giant flightless bird, or perhaps a surviving population of megafaunal predators that had adapted to the unique conditions of this ecosystem. And he had come equipped with tranquilizer darts, capture nets, and specimen jars, because he intended to return to civilization with proof that would restore his reputation and validate the years of ostracism he had endured. But as the afternoon light began to slant toward evening, and the shadows of the dead cedars stretched across the white sand like the fingers of reaching hands, he found his scientific certainty eroding beneath the weight of the silence and the desolation, replaced by something more primitive and less comfortable, a creeping awareness that the barrens were not merely a place but a presence, an entity that observed their intrusion with a patience that predated human habitation and would continue long after their bones had been scattered and forgotten. The first farmstead appeared without warning as they crested a low dune, the structures materializing from the haze of distance like a hallucination induced by heat and dehydration, and John felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the architectural style from the historical photographs he had studied. The saltbox farmhouse with its collapsed roof, and the leaning outbuildings that had once housed chickens and goats, and perhaps a solitary milk cow. The settlement had been abandoned sometime in the 1950s, according to the county records, a family named Whitfield who had simply stopped coming to town for supplies. Their absence noted by the postmaster after 3 weeks of undelivered mail, and investigated by a sheriff's deputy who had reported the buildings empty, but for a kitchen table still set for a meal that had never been eaten, the food desiccated, and the chairs pushed back as if the diners had risen in unison and walked out into the barrens never to return. John had dismissed the official report as the romanticized fiction of a bored lawman, but standing before the farmhouse now, its clapboards weathered to the color of old bone and its windows gaping like empty eye sockets, he felt the first cold intrusion of doubt into his carefully constructed rationalism. The door hung open on rusted hinges that screamed in protest when Marcus pushed it inward, the sound unnaturally loud in the surrounding stillness, and the interior revealed a scene of disruption that did not match the official narrative of simple abandonment. The table had been overturned, its legs snapped cleanly as if by tremendous force, and the desiccated remains of what might have been food were scattered across the floor in a pattern that suggested violent ejection rather than gradual decay. More disturbing were the marks on the walls, deep gouges in the soft pine that ran vertically from floor to ceiling in parallel sets of 5, too regular to be natural, and too deep to have been made by any tool that John could identify from his experience in field biology. They explored the outbuildings with the cautious movements of people who had begun to suspect that they were not the first visitors to this place, and that whatever had preceded them had not been human, and it was Rebecca who found the first evidence of livestock death in the collapsed structure that had once served as a barn. She did not scream when she saw what waited in the darkness, but her sharp intake of breath drew the others to her side, and John felt his professional composure crack like thin ice beneath the weight of what his eyes reported. The animal had been a pig, a large sow judging by the size of the remains, but it had been transformed by some process that defied the normal expectations of predation or decomposition. The carcass hung suspended from a beam by what appeared to be its own hide, the skin peeled back in a single sheet, and used as a crude sling to hold the body 3 feet above the ground, and the internal organs were gone, not eaten or scattered, but removed with surgical precision that left the cavity clean and dry, the edges of the excisions so neat that they might have been made with a scalpel wielded by a trained anatomist. But there was no scalpel here, no human agency in this desecration, and the horror deepened as John examined the ribcage and discovered that it had been snapped outward, the individual ribs splayed like the fingers of an opening hand, as if something had reached inside the living animal and expanded its grip until the bones had surrendered to the pressure. The smell was not what he expected, not the sweet corruption of meat left to rot in summer heat, but rather a clinical sterility, an absence of bacterial colonization that suggested the carcass had been chemically preserved or perhaps drained of the fluids that normally supported microbial life. "Processed," David said, his voice flat and carefully controlled, and the word hung in the air between them like a contaminant, because processed implied intentionality, a systematic approach to the acquisition and preparation of meat that belonged to intelligence rather than instinct, and John felt his relic species theory tremble beneath the implications of that single word. They photographed the remains with trembling hands and continued their survey of the farmstead, discovering in the root cellar a cache of mason jars that had been systematically smashed, their contents of preserved vegetables and fruits smeared across the dirt floor in a deliberate pattern of destruction that spoke of rage or perhaps of territorial marking, a message written in broken glass and rotting food that announced this place as claimed property. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when they emerged from the farmhouse, painting the white sand in shades of amber and blood, and John consulted his map to discover that the Whitfield farmstead sat precisely at the center of one of the red circles, the first confirmation that his cartographic research had identified a genuine pattern rather than the random clustering of unrelated tragedies. He should have felt vindicated, should have experienced the warm surge of validation that accompanies the transformation of hypothesis into observation, but instead he felt only a mounting dread that seemed to emanate from the sand itself, from the dead cedars that surrounded them like the bars of a cage, from the sky that darkened overhead with a rapidity that suggested the approach of storm systems that did not appear on any weather report. They decided to make camp at the farmstead despite the oppressive atmosphere, because David's leg was beginning to trouble him and the others were showing signs of fatigue that made further hiking inadvisable, and they set up their tents in the lee of the main building, where the crumbling walls would provide some protection from the wind that had begun to rise with the coming of dusk, carrying with it a smell of ozone and decay that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within the barrens. John took the first watch while the others retreated to their sleeping bags, ostensibly to rest but in reality to lie awake in the darkness and listen to the sounds that the wind carried from the surrounding wilderness, sounds that did not belong to any animal they could identify from their collective experience. There was a rhythm to the noise, a pattern of clicks and pauses that reminded John of the stridulation of insects, but lower in frequency and more deliberate in its construction, as if something were communicating across the distance in a language that predated human speech and operated on principles of acoustic signaling that no human ear had evolved to decode. He sat with his back against the wall of the farmhouse, his thermal imaging monocular pressed to his right eye, scanning the tree line for any sign of heat signature that would indicate the presence of a large mammal in the vicinity. but the device showed only the cool shapes of vegetation and the occasional warm blotch of a small rodent moving through the underbrush. Nothing that would account for the sounds or the lingering sense of being observed that made his skin crawl and his hands tremble on the monocular's grip. The trapper's camp appeared on no map that John had studied, materializing from the morning fog like a memory of violence preserved in the landscape, and they might have missed it entirely had not Rebecca's drone, which Marcus had launched for an aerial survey of their position, detected the anomalous heat signature of a recent campfire through the canopy cover. They had broken camp at dawn after a sleepless night punctuated by the clicking sounds that seemed to grow closer with each passing hour, and they were moving in the general direction of a series of colonial-era ruins that David believed might contain records of early encounters with the phenomenon that the settlers had called the Leeds Devil in their terrified letters to family members back in England. The trapper's camp consisted of a canvas wall tent that had been slashed open from above, the jagged edges of the canvas hanging like torn flesh from the aluminum frame, and a fire pit that still contained the white ash of a blaze that had burned itself out within the past 48 hours, based on the temperature readings from Marcus's thermal scanner. But the fire pit was not what drew their attention and held it in a grip of horrified fascination. It was the cedar tree that stood 20 feet from the camp, its trunk marked with deep parallel gouges that matched the pattern they had observed in the farmhouse, and the figure that had been affixed to its bark at chest height, pinned in place by a single object that transfixed the body with an almost architectural precision. The trapper had been a large man, judging by the proportions of the corpse, wearing the canvas and wool clothing typical of modern backwoods hunters, but his face was unrecognizable because something had removed the soft tissue with methodical thoroughness, leaving the skull exposed and grinning in a rictus that seemed almost mocking in its preservation. The barbed spike that held him to the tree emerged from the center of his chest, having passed cleanly through the sternum, and anchored in the heartwood behind him with sufficient force that the body hung suspended slightly above the ground, the toes of his boots dangling inches above the white sand. John approached the tree with the slow, cautious steps of a man walking through a minefield, his scientific curiosity warring with the primal imperative to flee, and he examined the spike with a detachment that he knew was partly shock-induced, and partly the survival mechanism of a mind that could not process the full horror of what it was witnessing without fragmenting into dissociation. The spike was not metal, as he had initially assumed, but rather a biological structure, a calcified protrusion some 3 feet in length and 6 inches in diameter at its base, tapering to a cruel point that had been further sharpened by abrasion against some hard surface, until it resembled a medieval bodkin designed to penetrate armor. The surface was not smooth like bone, but rather covered in backward-facing barbs, each 1 inch long and curved like a fishhook, designed to prevent extraction once the weapon had been driven home, and John recognized with a surge of nauseated clarity that this was a tail spike, a defensive or offensive appendage that no known species of mammal possessed in the modern fauna of North America. The ribcage of the corpse had been snapped outward in the same pattern they had observed in the pig carcass, the individual ribs splayed and broken, and John understood with terrible certainty that the trapper had been alive when the spike had been driven through him, that the creature had reached inside his chest cavity while he still breathed and performed the same extraction procedure that they had seen in the barn, removing the organs with surgical precision while the heart continued its futile beating. There was no blood on the sand beneath the body, no pool of bodily fluids that should have resulted from such trauma, and when John touched the corpse's arm he found it desiccated, mummified in a matter of hours rather than the weeks or months that normal decomposition required, as if something had drawn the moisture from the tissues with the efficiency of a laboratory freeze-dryer. Lena was recording everything, her audio capture picking up the harsh breathing of the group and the whispered exclamations of horror that escaped despite their attempts at professional composure, and John knew that this evidence would be sufficient to validate his theories, to prove that something unknown and terrible inhabited the Pine Barrens. But he also knew with growing certainty that they would not be returning to civilization with their findings. That the creature that had done this was not a relic species to be tranquilized and catalogued, but rather a predator of such sophistication and power that their expedition had become not a scientific investigation, but a funeral procession moving deeper into the territory of a being that viewed them as intruders to be eliminated with extreme prejudice. Dave found him there 10 minutes later, maybe an hour. Time had become elastic and meaningless. The guide pulled John away from the tree with a strength that suggested desperation, his hands rough on John's shoulders, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move, now. It knows we're here. It marked her. It marked all of us." "Marked us," John repeated, his voice sounding distant and strange in his own ears. "The scream," Dave said, his eyes on the darkness above them. "It wasn't just a sound. It was a signature. It recorded our heartbeats. It knows our rhythms now. It can track us by the sound of our blood." They ran back to the camp, where Marcus had managed to stand, though he was swaying, his face pale, his hands trembling. Rachel was on her feet too, her medical training overriding her terror, and she was checking each of them for injuries, her fingers probing with a gentleness that seemed obscene in the context of what they had found. They were uninjured physically, but their noses were bleeding, all of them, thin trickles of blood that ran from their nostrils and dried on their upper lips, and their ears were ringing with a persistence that suggested permanent damage. The creature's scream had been a weapon, a sonic assault that had burst capillaries and overloaded the vestibular system, and they were all walking wounded, disoriented and nauseous and deaf to the frequencies that might have warned them of the next attack. They packed in silence, moving with a haste that bordered on panic. John insisted on bringing Sarah's camera, though the lens was cracked and the memory card was missing, stolen by the creature or crushed under its hooves. He insisted on photographing the scene, on documenting the arrangement of the organs, the pattern of the ribcage, the angle of the tail spike through the sternum. Rachel told him he was insane. Marcus told him he was a ghoul. Dave told him nothing, only watched the tree line with eyes that seemed to have aged 20 years in 20 minutes. And John photographed, his hands shaking, his flash illuminating the carnage in strobing bursts of white light that made the blood seem to move, made the organs seem to pulse, made the dead tree appear to breathe. They fled the camp as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the dead cedars, moving not toward the trailhead. They had lost the trail, had never really had a trail, had followed Dave's truck into a wilderness that swallowed paths as quickly as they were made. But in the general direction of the east, where the sand was firmer and the trees were shorter, and the sky was visible as a strip of gray between the branches. John walked in the lead, his compass in his hand, his eyes on the needle that spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north in a landscape that seemed to generate its own fields. Behind him, Rachel supported Marcus, who was still vomiting intermittently, his body rejecting the trauma in a physical purge that left him weak and stumbling. Dave walked at the rear, his knife in his hand, his eyes on the canopy, and John could hear him muttering under his breath, not prayers but instructions, a litany of warnings that had been passed down through generations of Pineys. Don't look up. Don't listen for the clicking. Don't follow the voice. And whatever you do, don't run. Running triggers the chase instinct. Running tells it you're prey. But they were prey. John understood this now, with a certainty that transcended his scientific ambition and entered the realm of biological fact. They were not explorers. They were not researchers. They were intruders in a territory that had been claimed and defended for centuries, and the creature that occupied this territory was not a relic species to be studied and catalogued. It was an apex predator that viewed the entire barrens as its nest, and they had violated the boundary, had entered the nursery. And the punishment for trespass was not death but processing, not predation but butchery, a systematic reduction of the human form into components that could be arranged and displayed and consumed at leisure. The sand shifted beneath their feet as they walked, the white dunes of the Pine Barrens rising and falling in patterns that suggested not geology but respiration. The ghost forests gave way to living forests, the dead cedars replaced by scrub oak and pitch pine, and the occasional towering loblolly that seemed to have been transplanted from a different ecosystem. The air grew thick with humidity, the sandy soil transitioning to peat, and John realized that they were being herded. The creature was not allowing them to escape. It was directing them, using the wind walls generated by its wings to push them off course, to funnel them deeper into the swamp where the ground was soft and the trees were dense, and the sky was a distant memory. He could feel the wind when it came, not as a natural gust but as a pressure wave that struck them from the side with a force that knocked them off their feet, that filled their ears with a sound like rushing water and their mouths with the taste of copper and ozone. Each time they tried to correct their course, to steer east toward the distant highway, the wind would come again, stronger, more insistent, driving them south and west into the heart of the Barrens. And then the voice began. It was Sarah's voice, or a distorted imitation of it, calling from the fog that had risen from the swamp with the suddenness of a stage curtain. John, it called, sweet and high and wrong, the syllables stretched and warped as though spoken through a mouth that was not human. John, come here, I found something. I found the nest. Rachel heard it too. She stopped, her hand tightening on Marcus's arm, her face draining of what little color remained. That's not Sarah, she whispered. Sarah's dead. That's not Sarah. It's mimicking her, Dave said, his voice flat and empty. It does that. It learns the sounds. It uses them as bait. The voice came again, closer now, from a stand of cedar trees that had been twisted by some force into a configuration that resembled a cage. John, I'm scared. It's dark. I can't find my way out. Please come help me. John felt the pull of the voice, a physical tug in his chest that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, and he understood that Dave was right, that the creature was not merely mimicking Sarah's words but her frequency, the specific cadence and pitch that triggered recognition in John's auditory cortex. It was a biological hack, a sonic key that unlocked the door of empathy and trust, and the urge to follow it was almost irresistible. He took a step toward the cedars, his hand reaching out as though to grasp Sarah's, and Dave grabbed him by the collar and yanked him backward with a violence that sent them both sprawling into the sand. Don't, Dave hissed, his face inches from John's, his breath hot and sour. That's how it hunts. It separates the weak from the herd. It uses the voice to lure them into the ambush zone. If you go in there, you don't come out. You come out as parts. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than the silence of the forest, a silence that seemed to have been vacuum-sealed over the swamp, a silence in which the absence of sound became a presence in its own right. And then the clicking began again, the rhythmic guttural sound that John now recognized as the creature's echolocation, a biological sonar that mapped the terrain, and its occupants with a precision that made human technology seem primitive. The clicking grew louder, closer, and John could feel it in his sternum, a vibration that seemed to be searching for his heart, measuring its rhythm, calculating the optimal moment to strike. Move, Dave said, and they moved, running now, abandoning the pretense of stealth, their feet sinking into the sand and the peat, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering against their ribs in a rhythm that John knew was being monitored, that was being tracked, that was being used as a beacon by the creature that hunted not by sight but by sound. They ran until they could run no more, until Marcus collapsed, his legs giving out beneath him, his body curled into a ball of sweat and vomit and terror. They were in a clearing, surrounded by cedars that grew so closely together that their branches interlocked overhead, creating a green roof that blocked the sky and reduced the light to a perpetual twilight. The clicking had stopped, the wind had stopped, the voice had stopped, and for a moment John allowed himself to believe that they had escaped, that the creature had lost interest, that they were safe. Then the canopy moved. Not with the wind, there was no wind, but with the passage of something massive above it, something whose weight bent the branches and stirred the leaves into a circular pattern that radiated outward from a central point. John looked up, his neck craning, his eyes searching the green ceiling for the source of the movement, and he saw it. A hole in the canopy, a circular absence where the branches had been not broken but folded, pressed downward by a force that had compacted them into a tunnel shape, a passage through which the creature could descend without touching the sides. And in the center of that hole, growing larger with each second, were the eyes. They were red, not the red of blood or fire, but the red of hot iron, the red of a forge, a luminescence that seemed to generate its own heat, its own gravity. They were set in a face that was horse-like only in the most abstract sense, elongated and narrow, with nostrils that flared and contracted with a wet sound that John could hear even from 30 feet below. And beneath the eyes, emerging from the darkness of the hole, were the wings. Not feathered but leathery, stretched over fingers that were longer than John's arm, the membrane veined with a network of dark vessels that pulsed with the same rhythm as the eyes. The creature was descending, folding its wings against its body, dropping through the tunnel of compressed branches with a speed that seemed to violate the laws of terminal velocity, and John understood with a clarity that felt like falling that the ambush zone had not been the cedars where Sarah's voice had called. The ambush zone was here. The ambush zone was now. "Run!" Dave screamed, but the word was unnecessary because they were already running, scattering like quail, their bodies moving with a desperation that bypassed thought and operated on pure instinct. John ran toward the edge of the clearing, toward a gap in the cedars that promised escape, and he heard behind him a sound that he would hear for the rest of his life, however long that life might be. The sound of cloven hooves striking the earth with a force that cracked the sandstone, the sound of leathery wings snapping open to arrest the descent, and the sound of Marcus screaming. Marcus had been the slowest. He had been trailing behind Rachel, his legs unsteady, his lungs heaving, and the creature had calculated this, had measured his weakness against the strength of the others, and had selected him as the next target. John turned against his better judgment, against every survival instinct that told him to keep running, to not look back, to not witness what was about to happen, and he saw the creature in full for the first time, really saw it. Not as a shadow or a silhouette, but as a biological entity that occupied space and generated force, and moved with a muscularity that was both reptilian and mammalian and avian, a chimera of evolutionary experimentation that had found, in the Pine Barrens, the perfect niche for its particular combination of traits. It was 8 feet tall at the shoulder, perhaps 12 feet in total length from the snout to the barbed tail that lashed behind it like a scorpion's stinger. Its body was covered in short, black fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving it a quality of visual uncertainty that made it difficult to focus on, as though the eye were being repelled by some optical property of the hair. Its legs were digitigrade, the joints bending backward like a kangaroo's, and the muscles that bunched and released beneath the fur were visible as rippling contours that suggested a power far beyond anything of comparable size. The hooves were cloven, each one the size of a dinner plate, and they struck the earth with a sound like gunshots, cracking the sandstone and sending up puffs of white dust. The wings were folded now, tucked against its back like a cloak, but John could see the leading edges, the serrated claws that served as the creature's fingers, and he understood that the wings were not merely for flight. They were weapons. They were shovels. They were the tools that allowed the creature to compress its prey into a smaller space, to fold the ribcage and drive the organs through the pelvic girdle, to reduce the human form to a package that could be carried into the canopy and consumed at leisure. Marcus was on the ground, his hands raised in a gesture of supplication that was both pathetic and brave, and the creature stood over him, its head lowered, its red eyes fixed on his face with an expression that John could only describe as curiosity, as though the creature were examining a new species of insect and trying to determine whether it was edible. Marcus was saying something, a stream of words that might have been begging or might have been praying or might have been the disconnected rambling of a mind that had reached the limit of its capacity to process horror. The creature did not seem to hear him. It raised one of its forelimbs, the clawed hand that was not a hand but a grasping organ, and it struck. The blow was not a swipe. It was a grab. The claws closed around Marcus's head, the talons sinking into the temples with a precision that suggested anatomical knowledge, and the creature lifted him. Not far, only a few feet, enough to clear the ground, enough to position him for what came next. Marcus screamed then, a high-pitched shriek that was cut short when the creature's hind legs flexed, and it leaped, not forward but upward, its kangaroo-like musculature generating a thrust that sent it soaring into the canopy with a single bound, carrying Marcus with it, his body dangling from the clawed hand like a doll. The wings snapped open with a sound like wet leather being stretched, and the creature caught an updraft, rising through the hole in the canopy and vanishing into the darkness above, leaving behind only the echo of Marcus's scream and the smell of ozone and copper. But Marcus did not die immediately. John could hear him above the canopy, his screams continuing in bursts that suggested consciousness, that suggested awareness, that suggested the creature was taking its time. And then John saw what the creature was doing. It had not carried Marcus away to consume him in private. It had suspended him in the trees, using its barbed tail as a hook, the serrated spike driven through Marcus's shoulder blade with a force that pinned him to the trunk of a towering oak, 60 feet above the ground. The creature was above him now, hovering on wings that beat with a slow, rhythmic precision, and it began to dismantle him with a patience that was more terrible than rage. John saw the clawed hands move, saw them tear through Marcus's jacket and shirt, saw them peel back the skin of his chest with a precision that suggested not hunger but artistry. Marcus screamed, a sound that blended with the creature's own rhythmic clicking, and John watched, paralyzed by horror, as the creature removed the organs one by one, holding each up to the moonlight as though inspecting it, before placing it in a pouch of membrane that hung from its neck like a marsupial's pouch. The liver, the kidneys, the stomach, still full of the Wawa sandwich that Marcus had eaten 12 hours before. The creature worked methodically, and Marcus's screams gradually diminished, not because he was dead but because he was going into shock, his body shutting down in a final mercy that his mind had not yet accepted. And then the creature began to feed, not on the organs which it had stored, but on the muscle, tearing strips of flesh from the thighs and shoulders with teeth that were white and serrated and longer than John's thumb. The sound was wet, rhythmic, like a dog tearing at a rope toy, and John could see the blood falling in a fine rain, spattering the leaves below, turning the white sand dark. Marcus's head hung at an angle that suggested a broken neck, but his eyes were still open, still moving, still aware, and John realized with a nausea that nearly drove him to his knees that the creature was keeping him alive, that it was feeding in a way that maximized the duration of the suffering, that it understood, in whatever passed for its mind, that the fear and the pain were not byproducts but ingredients. "Don't watch," Dave hissed, grabbing John by the arm and dragging him away. "Don't listen. It wants you to watch, it wants you to hear. That's part of the hunt." They ran, the three of them now, John, Rachel, and Dave, leaving Marcus's body suspended in the trees, leaving the creature to its feast, leaving the clearing that had become an abattoir. They ran through the cedars, through the scrub oak, through the sawgrass that cut their legs and the peat that sucked at their boots, and behind them, above them, the creature continued its work, the wet sounds of butchery accompanied by the rhythmic clicking that John now understood was not echolocation but communication, a broadcast that announced to any others of its kind that the territory had been defended, the intruders had been culled, and the nest was secure. They ran until they could run no more, until their legs gave out beneath them, and they collapsed into a tangle of vines and moss, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering against their ribs in a rhythm that John knew was being monitored, that was being tracked, that was being used as a beacon by the creature that hunted not by sight but by sound. They lay in the darkness, gasping, their bodies pressed against the damp earth, and John felt something beneath his hand that was not moss or vine but stone, a flat surface of worked granite that suggested not nature but human intervention. He turned his flashlight toward it, his beam trembling, and he saw what they had found. It was a ruin, not a house, not a cabin, but a cellar, a subterranean structure of stone and mortar that had been built in the 1700s and had survived the centuries with a stubbornness that matched the wilderness around it. The walls were 3 feet thick, the granite blocks fitted together without mortar in a technique that suggested colonial craftsmanship, and the ceiling was a vaulted arch of brick that had cracked in places but had not collapsed. The entrance was a low doorway, partially blocked by fallen debris, and beyond it John could see darkness, a space that smelled of earth and mildew and something else, something organic and sharp that made his sinuses burn. "Inside," Rachel whispered, her voice raw and broken. "We need to get inside. The stone will protect us." John did not believe this. He had seen the creature's strength, had watched it crack sandstone with its hooves and compress branches with its passage. Stone would not stop it. Nothing would stop it. But the cellar offered a psychological refuge, a womb of darkness where they could hide from the sky, and they crawled through the doorway, their bodies pressed against the cold granite, and they huddled in the corner farthest from the entrance, their flashlight beams sweeping the interior in desperate arcs. The cellar was not empty. There were shelves along one wall, rotted wood that had collapsed under the weight of glass jars and leather-bound books, and on the floor, scattered like leaves, were papers that crumbled to dust when John touched them. He picked up one that had survived, a sheet of vellum that had been treated with something that had prevented its decomposition, and he held it in the beam of his flashlight and read the words that had been written in iron gall ink 300 years before. "The occupant came again last night," the paper read. "I heard the clicking in the swamp, the same clicking that precedes every visit, and I barred the door and shuttered the windows and prayed to a God who has not answered my prayers in 20 years. It did not try to enter. It does not need to enter. It knows that I am here, and it knows that I cannot leave, and that knowledge is enough to sustain it. It is not a predator in the ordinary sense. It is a warden. It guards the barrens as a wolf guards its den, with a ferocity that is not cruelty but instinct, not malice but biology. And I have come to understand that my presence here, my survival, is permitted only because I provide a service. I am the witness. I am the one who records, who documents, who ensures that the story of the occupant is not lost. It allows me to live because I am useful to it. And when I am no longer useful, when my pen runs dry and my eyes grow dim, it will come for me, and it will process me as it processes all the others, and my bones will be added to the collection that litters the swamp." The paper was signed Ezekiel Crowe, 1742. John read the words twice, 3 times, his lips moving in a silent repetition that was not prayer but incantation, not belief but the desperate clinging to any narrative that might explain the horror they had witnessed. The mother's curse. The 13th child. The creature that viewed the barrens as its nest. He had spent his adult life searching for the biological reality behind the legend. And now, huddled in a colonial cellar with his sister and Dave and the smell of butchery still in his nostrils, he understood that the legend was the reality. The Jersey Devil was not a relic species of prehistoric mammal. It was something older and stranger, something that occupied the space where biology and folklore intersected, a creature that was simultaneously animal and spirit and territorial imperative made flesh. Rachel found the journals. They were in a wooden chest that had been sealed with wax and buried beneath a layer of sand that had infiltrated the cellar through cracks in the walls. She broke the wax with her pocket knife and opened the chest, and the smell that emerged was not of decay but of preservation, of cedar oil and camphor, and the sharp, clean scent of old paper. The journals were the records of the cellar's builder, the same Ezekiel Crow, and they contained hundreds of pages of observations, sketches, and terrified speculation about the creature that had claimed the barrens as its own. John read the journals with a fascination that bordered on religious awe. Crow had understood what John was only now beginning to grasp, that the creature was not an animal to be studied, but a force to be survived, that its biology was not a subject for scientific inquiry, but a system of rules that governed behavior in the same way that gravity governed falling. The creature hunted by sound, by the vibration of the heartbeat, by the specific frequency of blood moving through veins. It was blinded by bright light, its nocturnal eyes adapted to darkness so extreme that even a candle flame caused it pain. It was territorial, yes, but it was also intelligent, capable of mimicry, of tool use, of the systematic herding of prey into kill zones where the environment itself became a weapon. Crow had described, in entries that grew increasingly erratic as the months progressed, the creature's method of processing its kills, a term that John now understood was not euphemism but taxonomy. The creature did not eat its prey in the manner of a lion or a wolf, tearing flesh from bone in a frenzy of consumption. It removed the organs first, arranging them in patterns that Crow had tried to sketch but could not reproduce, configurations that seemed to change depending on the phase of the moon or the direction of the wind. It preserved the meat with chemical secretions that prevented decay, that kept the tissue fresh for weeks, suggesting a predator that did not kill for immediate need but for storage, for stockpiling, for the maintenance of a larder in a territory where prey was scarce and the hunting season was eternal. And it was above them now. John heard the weight of it landing on the cellar roof, a pressure that caused the vaulted brick to groan and crack, dust filtering down through the seams in a gray rain that coated their hair and shoulders. Rachel gasped, her hand finding John's, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture of sibling solidarity that had not occurred between them since childhood. The creature was on the roof. It was testing the structure, calculating its load-bearing capacity, determining whether the stone was thick enough to withstand its assault or whether it needed to find another way in. John looked at the journals, at Crow's words, and he understood that the cellar was not a refuge. It was a trap. It was a kill box that the creature had used before, that it knew intimately, and it was waiting for the optimal moment to collapse the roof and complete its work. The clicking began, not from outside but from directly above, transmitted through the stone and mortar with a clarity that suggested the creature's claws were scraping against the brick, searching for weak points, testing the seams. Then the scream came. Not the high-pitched shriek that had drawn blood from their noses, but a lower, more resonant sound, a sonic attack that was directed not at their sinuses but at their eardrums, a frequency that caused the remaining glass in the cellar windows to shatter and the dust to rise from the floor in a choking cloud. Rachel clutched her ears, her mouth open in a scream that produced no sound, and John felt the pressure in his own ears build to a point that suggested rupture, a pain so intense that he fell to his knees, his body convulsing, his vision reduced to a tunnel of white agony. The roof held. For a moment, for an eternity, the roof held, the 3-foot granite and the vaulted brick resisting the sonic assault with a stubbornness that matched the wilderness itself. But John could hear the cracks spreading, could see the mortar crumbling, could feel the structure failing around them in a cascade of failures that was as inevitable as gravity. The creature was not merely screaming. It was singing the roof to destruction, finding the resonant frequency of the stone and amplifying it until the material itself began to vibrate apart, until the bonds between the molecules surrendered to the pressure and the cellar became a tomb. "The flare," Rachel screamed, her voice barely audible above the sonic assault, her hands fumbling in her pack. Marcus's flare, he had a high-intensity flare. John understood. He had read Crow's journals, had memorized the passages about the creature's nocturnal eyes, their adaptation to darkness, their vulnerability to concentrated light. It was the only weakness, the only flaw in the armor, and Marcus, with his taste for extreme experiences, had carried a magnesium flare in his pack, a device designed to signal rescue teams in whiteout conditions, a light source that burned at 3,000 degrees and produced a beam bright enough to blind. Rachel found it. She pulled the flare from Marcus's abandoned pack, her hands shaking, her fingers tearing at the safety cap. The roof was failing now, chunks of granite falling into the cellar, dust filling the air until they could not see, could not breathe, could only choke and gasp in the darkness. John grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her toward the corner where the walls were thickest, and he watched as she struck the ignition, watched as the flare bloomed into a white sun that filled the cellar with a light so intense that it burned through his closed eyelids, that seared his retinas with an afterimage that would never fade. The creature screamed, not in rage but in pain, a shriek that was different from its hunting cry, higher and more desperate, the sound of a predator that had been wounded in its most sensitive organ. John opened his eyes, risking blindness, and through the white glare he saw the hole in the roof, saw the creature's face framed in the opening, saw the red eyes dimming, the pupils contracting to pinpricks, the leathery wings snapping shut as though to shield the face from the light. It was blinded. For a moment, perhaps only seconds, it was blinded, and its sonic attack stopped, and the roof stopped failing, and the cellar was silent except for the hiss of the flare and their own ragged breathing. "Run!" John gasped, and they ran. They scrambled through the doorway, through the debris, into the night that was not night but a perpetual twilight lit by the magnesium glare. They ran through the swamp, through the sand, through the sawgrass that cut their legs and the peat that sucked at their boots, and behind them they heard the creature thrashing in the canopy, its wings beating against the trees, its screams of pain and frustration echoing through the barrens like the cries of a demon being dragged back to hell. They did not look back. They did not listen for the clicking. They ran, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering, their bodies pushed beyond exhaustion into a realm of pure survival instinct that recognized no pain, no fatigue, no limit. The sand shifted beneath their feet as they ran, the white dunes rising and falling in patterns that suggested not geology but respiration. The ghost forests gave way to living forests, the dead cedars replaced by scrub oak and pitch pine, but the trees were sparse here, the canopy broken, the sky visible as strips of gray between the branches. John ran in the lead, his flashlight beam stabbing ahead into the darkness, his feet sinking into the loose sand with each stride. Behind him, Rachel ran with her hands clamped over her ears, her face pale and streaked with dust and blood. And behind her, Dave ran with his knife in his hand, his eyes fixed on the canopy, his head constantly turning to scan the sky. The creature had recovered. John could hear it in the distance, the thrashing of wings against branches, the screams of pain and frustration giving way to a rhythmic clicking that was louder than before, more insistent, a biological sonar that seemed to be searching for them with a renewed intensity. The flare had blinded it, but blindness for the creature was temporary, a matter of seconds rather than minutes, and now it was hunting again, tracking them by the sound of their hearts, by the vibrations of their feet against the sand, by the heat signatures that radiated from their bodies into the cooling night air. "Keep moving," Dave shouted, his voice raw and cracked. "Don't stop, it can smell the fear, it can taste the exhaustion." They ran through a stand of dwarf pines that grew in a spiral pattern, the trees twisted by some force that John did not understand, their branches reaching toward the sky like the fingers of drowning men. The sand gave way to peat, the ground becoming soft and treacherous, sucking at their boots with each step. Rachel stumbled, her ankle turning on a root, and John caught her arm, pulling her upright, feeling the tremor that ran through her body like an electrical current. "I can't," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "I can't run anymore. My lungs are burning. My legs are gone." "You can," John said, and his voice was harder than he felt, a performance of strength that he hoped would be contagious. "You have to. For Sarah, for Marcus, for yourself." They ran on, the peat giving way to sand again, the terrain rising in a series of low dunes that blocked their view of what lay ahead. John could hear the creature now, not in the distance but close, the wingbeats stirring the air above them, the clicking resonating in his sternum with a physicality that made his teeth ache. It was circling, he realized, circling above them like a shark in the water, waiting for the optimal moment to strike, for one of them to fall, to slow, to become separated from the herd. And then Dave fell. Not from exhaustion but from impact, a pressure wave that struck him from above with the force of a falling tree, driving him into the sand with a violence that sent a puff of white dust rising into the air. John turned, his flashlight beam sweeping back, and he saw the creature descending through a hole in the canopy, its wings folded, its body dropping like a spear, its talons extended. It took Dave not with the claws but with the hind legs. The creature landed with a force that cracked the sandstone, its hooves driving 6 inches into the loose soil, and before Dave could rise, before he could raise his knife or roll away or even scream, the creature had him. Its digitigrade legs bent and flexed, the kangaroo-like musculature generating a grip that was not just strength but hydraulic pressure, and the claws on its hind feet, curved blades that John had not noticed before, hidden beneath the fur and folded against the ankles, extended and sank into Dave's shoulders with a precision that suggested anatomical knowledge. Dave screamed. It was not a word but a sound, a high-pitched shriek that contained all the terror and pain that the human voice could produce, and John watched, paralyzed by horror, as the creature lifted him. Not into the air but into a position of suspension, the hind legs holding Dave upright, the claws buried in his shoulder blades, his feet dangling inches above the sand. Dave's face was visible in the moonlight, his mouth open, his eyes wide and aware, and John saw the moment when Dave understood what was happening, when he realized that the creature was not going to carry him away or drop him from a height or pin him to a tree. The creature was going to tear him in half. The hind legs flexed, the muscles bunched and released, and John heard the sound of Dave's spine snapping, not at one point but at multiple points, a series of dry cracks like firewood being broken over a knee. But the spine did not sever. It held barely, the spinal cord still transmitting signals, still carrying pain to a brain that was screaming for release. The creature adjusted its grip, the claws repositioning in Dave's flesh, and then it began to pull. The sound was like wet fabric tearing, like a tree trunk splitting under the weight of ice, like nothing John had ever heard, and nothing he would ever forget. Dave's body opened at the midline, the skin parting along a line that ran from sternum to groin, the abdominal muscles separating with a series of snaps that suggested individual fiber failure. The ribcage, which had been compressed by the creature's grip, now sprang outward, the bones breaking with a sound like popcorn in a microwave, and the organs that had been contained within, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, the kidneys, spilled out in a cascade of gray and pink and red that painted the white sand in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. But the creature was not finished. The spine was still holding, the spinal cord still intact, and Dave was still alive, his eyes moving, his mouth working, his body trying to scream but producing only a wet gurgle as blood filled his lungs. The creature's hind legs flexed again, generating a force that seemed to come not from muscle, but from some hydraulic system that operated on principles of pressure and leverage that no human anatomy had ever evolved. And with a final, terrible crack, the spine separated. Dave's body came apart in 2 pieces, the torso held in the creature's right hind claws, the pelvis and legs held in the left, and the cavity that had been his abdomen was now a hollow tube of meat and bone that dripped blood and spinal fluid onto the sand. The creature held the 2 halves of Dave's body for a moment, as though inspecting its work, and then it cast them aside with a gesture that was almost casual, the torso landing in a tangle of scrub oak, the legs falling into a patch of sawgrass that turned red with the blood that pumped from the severed arteries. Dave's head, still attached to the torso, rolled to face John, the eyes open and fixed, the mouth frozen in an expression of agony that would never fade. "Run!" Rachel screamed, and her voice broke the paralysis that had held John immobile, shattered the trance of horror that had rooted him to the sand. They ran, the two of them now, leaving Dave's remains in the clearing, leaving the creature to its work, leaving the sand that had turned to mud beneath the volume of blood that had been spilled. They ran through the barrens with a desperation that bordered on madness, their bodies pushed beyond exhaustion into a realm of pure survival instinct that recognized no pain, no fatigue, no limit. The creature did not pursue them immediately. It had fed, or whatever equivalent of feeding applied to a creature that left its prey crushed and uneaten, and it was occupied with Dave's remains, with the process of arranging the organs and preserving the meat, and adding another specimen to the biological bulletin board that littered its territory. But the clicking began again, not from behind them but from above, a rhythmic sound that seemed to be tracking them, herding them, directing them toward a destination that the creature had chosen. John realized, through the haze of terror, that they were being driven toward the highway, that the creature was allowing them to escape, that the escape was not a mercy but a strategy. The creature was releasing them back into the world to carry the story, to spread the fear, to ensure that the legend would never die and the territory would never be safe. They reached the highway at dawn, their bodies broken, their minds shattered, their clothes hanging in rags. The road was a two-lane strip of asphalt that cut through the wilderness like a scar, and in the distance, John saw the headlights of a patrol car, the yellow beams cutting through the morning fog. He stepped into the road, waving his arms, his flashlight beam sweeping in an arc that he hoped would be visible, and the patrol car slowed, stopped, and the officer emerged with his hand on his holster and his eyes wide with disbelief. The officer later told his sergeant that he had never seen human beings look so damaged, so hollowed out, so reduced to the essential animal core of terror and exhaustion. John and Rachel were taken to the hospital, treated for dehydration, shock, lacerations, ruptured eardrums, and the psychological trauma that would never fully heal. They were questioned by state police, by FBI agents, by officials who could not understand their answers, who filed reports that suggested drug-induced hallucination or cult activity or a bizarre prank gone wrong. The bodies of Sarah and Marcus and Dave were never found. The cellar of Ezekiel Crow was never located, and the official report concluded that the expedition had been attacked by a bear or perhaps by a human predator, and that the survivors' accounts were unreliable due to trauma and exhaustion. But John and Rachel knew the truth. They knew that the creature was still out there, circling in the barrens, waiting for the next intruder, the next skeptic, the next fool who would wander too far from the paths and too deep into the wilderness. They knew that the clicking was not a figment of their imagination, but a biological reality, a sonic signature that marked the boundaries of the creature's territory and announced its presence to any who had the ears to hear. Rachel gave up her veterinary practice and moved to Arizona, to a city of flat roofs and wide streets where the sky was visible and empty, and the trees were ornamental and small. She did not speak to John for 5 years, and when she finally called him on the anniversary of their escape, her voice was thin and distant and filled with a terror that had not diminished with time. "I heard it," she said. "Last night, the clicking and then the scream. Under a clear sky, John, under a perfectly clear sky." John held the phone to his ear, his hand shaking, his eyes on the window of his apartment on the darkness beyond the glass. "Where are you?" he asked. "Tucson," she whispered. "But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where we are. It marked us. It recorded our heartbeats. It knows us. And it doesn't forget." The line went dead. John stood in his apartment, the phone in his hand. his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that he knew was being monitored, that was being tracked, that was being used as a beacon by a creature that had evolved beyond the reach of human understanding, beyond the reach of human fear, into something that was as natural and as inevitable as the sand beneath the pines and the cedars that grew from it, and the silence that swallowed the screams of those who wandered too far from the paths and too deep into the wilderness. He did not sleep that night. He sat by the window, his eyes on the sky, waiting for the clicking, waiting for the scream, waiting for the red eyes that he knew were out there somewhere, circling, hunting, remembering. And in the distance, carried on a wind that should not have been strong enough to travel so far, he heard a sound. It was not thunder. It was not a jet. It was a shriek, triumphant and hungry, that marked him as known prey, that told him in a language older than words that he had not escaped the Barrens, that no one ever escaped the Barrens, that the creature had simply released him back into the world to carry the memory of its power, to spread the fear that was its true nourishment, to ensure that the legend would never die and the territory would never be safe. He closed his eyes. He held his breath. He waited for the sound to fade, but it did not fade. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be originating from directly above his apartment, from a sky that was empty of clouds and full of stars, from a darkness that was not empty but occupied, not silent but listening, not safe but waiting. The creature was there. It had always been there, and it would always be there until the day when John's heart finally stopped hammering, and the silence that followed would be the silence of the Barrens, the silence of the sand, the silence of something that had been waiting for him to fall, to fail, to return. He returned on the anniversary of the escape, in the 3rd year, not because he wanted to, but because he could not stop himself, because the clicking had grown so loud in his mind that it had drowned out the sounds of the city, because the red glow had become so persistent in his peripheral vision that he could no longer distinguish between the creature's gaze and his own thoughts. He drove to the Wawa on Route 563, the same Wawa where they had met Dave, and he parked his car and walked into the Barrens with nothing but a flashlight and a knife, not to fight, not to escape, but to submit. The creature was waiting for him in the clearing where Sarah had died. The body was gone, consumed by scavengers and time, but the bloodstain remained, a black mark on the tree trunk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its red eyes pulsing, its wings folded, its barbed tail lashing the sand, and John walked toward it with his hands open, his heart hammering, his mind empty of everything except the biological imperative that had brought him here. "I understand," John said, and his voice was steady. "I understand what you are. You're not a monster, you're a system, and I am the next component to be processed." The creature did not move. It only watched, its eyes pulsing in rhythm with John's heart, and John felt the gaze upon him, the same pressure he had felt in the cellar, the same weight that seemed to be pressing him into the earth. He walked closer, close enough to smell the ozone and copper, close enough to see the texture of the fur, the individual hairs that absorbed light, the muscles that rippled beneath the skin. Then it moved, not fast but with a deliberation that was worse than speed, a step forward on cloven hooves that cracked the sandstone, the head lowering, the red eyes fixed on his face. John did not flinch. He had spent his life studying biology, and now he was about to become the subject of the most intimate biological study imaginable. The creature raised one of its forelimbs, the claws extending, and John watched them descend toward his chest with a fascination that was stronger than his fear. The claws parted his skin with a precision that was almost gentle, a vertical incision from sternum to navel that opened him like a book. John felt the cold air enter his chest cavity, felt the sudden change in pressure, and he looked down to see his own ribs exposed, the white bone gleaming in the moonlight. The creature worked methodically, its claws moving with a delicacy that was obscene in its care, and John felt the neurological dampening begin, a humming that seemed to emanate from the creature's chest, a frequency that reduced the pain to a distant ache, and allowed him to observe his own butchery with a clarity that was not merciful but was, in its own terrible way, a gift. The creature scored his ribs with the claws, tracing lines that served as guides, and then it struck from both sides simultaneously. The sound was like a book being snapped shut, a dry crack that echoed through the clearing, and John felt his ribs break outward, the bones snapping and folding back like the petals of a macabre flower. His rib cage was open. The creature removed his lungs first, the collapsed tissue lifted free and placed on the sand. Then the liver, dark and glistening. Then the kidneys, paired and pale. Then the heart, which the creature held in its claws for a moment, inspecting it, watching it beat one final time before it ceased. John died smiling. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally understood the punchline, who had realized that the joke was written into the blueprint from the beginning. He had spent his life searching for the biological reality behind the legend, and now he had become part of that reality, part of the evidence, part of the warning. His body hung from the tree where Sarah had hung, his organs arranged in the same pattern, his ribcage snapped outward in the same macabre bloom, and the creature stepped back to survey its work with the satisfaction of a predator that had completed its cycle, that had reclaimed its marked prey, that had restored the natural order of the barrens. The creature spread its wings and rose into the air, ascending through the canopy with a speed that seemed to violate the laws of aerodynamics. It circled the clearing once, twice, and then it flew south, toward the deeper barrens, toward the cedar swamps and the ghost forests where its territory extended for miles in every direction. It did not look back. It did not need to. The body would remain, a biological bulletin board that announced to any who might pass through, "This is my territory. These are my rules, and you have violated them." The sun rose 3 hours later, and the light touched John's face, his eyes open and fixed on the sky, his mouth frozen in the smile that had been his last expression. The blood that had painted the sand had begun to dry, and the organs that had been arranged beneath his feet had begun to attract flies. The creature would return to consume the meat, to add it to its larder, to preserve it with the chemical secretions that prevented decay. But for now, the body hung in the clearing, a monument to the biological reality that John had spent his life seeking, and had found, too late, in the most terrible way imaginable. Rachel heard the news 3 days later, delivered by a state trooper who knocked on her door in Tucson with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground. They had found John's body in the barrens, pinned to a tree, his organs arranged in a pattern that the coroner described as consistent with ritualistic killing, and the FBI described as consistent with an unsolved series of homicides dating back to 1974. They had questions. They wanted to know why John had returned to the barrens. They wanted to know what had happened to Dave, to Sarah, to Marcus. They wanted answers that Rachel could not give, because the answers were not in the language of investigation, but in the language of fear, and the language of fear was the only language that the creature understood. She told them what she could. She told them about the expedition, about the cellar, about the flare. She did not tell them about the clicking, about the heartbeat tracking, about the red glow that she still saw in her peripheral vision, that had followed her from New Jersey to Arizona and would follow her to whatever grave awaited her. She did not tell them that the creature was not a killer but a system, not a monster but a biological imperative, not evil but inevitable. She told them only what they could understand, and they filed their reports, and they closed the case, and they moved on to the next murder, the next disappearance, the next mystery that would never be solved because the solution was not available to human reason. Rachel sold her house. She moved to a basement apartment in a city where the sky was rarely visible, and the buildings were tall enough to block any view of what might be circling above. She worked a night shift in a parking garage, a structure of concrete and steel with no windows and a roof thick enough to stop anything but a direct nuclear strike. She did not look up. She did not look at the sky. She had learned to live in the subterranean world, the world of foundations and load-bearing walls and reinforced concrete, the world that the creature could not penetrate. But she still heard the clicking. It came to her in dreams, a subsonic hum that vibrated in her bones and stirred her from sleep with a gasp and a racing heart. She saw the creature in her dreams too, not attacking but observing, its red eyes fixed on her with an expression that she had learned to read as appraisal, as measurement, as the cold calculation of a predator that had already assessed her weaknesses and was simply waiting for the optimal moment to exploit them. She woke from these dreams with her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms, and she would sit in the dark until dawn, listening to the sounds of the city above her, waiting for the sound of cloven hooves on concrete, for the scream that would shatter her eardrums, for the red eyes that would blot out the fluorescent lights of the garage. She died in 2019, not from the creature but from cancer, a disease that was ordinary and explainable and merciful in its predictability. The obituary described her as a former veterinarian, a sister, a daughter, a woman who had loved animals and had dedicated her life to their care. It did not mention the Barrens. It did not mention the creature. It did not mention the clicking that had been her constant companion for the last decade of her life, the heartbeat that she had learned to control, to slow, to silence, in the vain hope that the creature would lose her signal and move on to other prey. But the creature had not lost her signal. It had simply been patient. And on the night of Rachel's death, as her heart finally stopped hammering and her breath ceased and her body cooled in the hospice bed, something passed over the building where she lay. The nurses heard it as a wind, a sudden gust that rattled the windows and stirred the curtains, and one of them, looking up from her station, saw a shape against the moon, vast and black and winged, with eyes that glowed red as coals. She rubbed her eyes, and when she looked again, the shape was gone, and the sky was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and the distant wail of an ambulance on the street below. The creature did not take Rachel's body. It did not need to. It had marked her, had tracked her, had waited for her to die, and now that she was dead, the hunt was over. The victory was not in the consumption but in the knowing, in the certainty that the prey had never escaped, that the territory had never been violated, that the Barrens remained inviolate and eternal and patient. The Pine Barrens remain. The creature remains. And the bodies continue to accumulate. The disappearances continue to be filed under lost hiker and probable bear attack and undetermined. The red circles on the hand-drawn maps continue to multiply, and the silence that swallows the screams of the victims continues to be deeper than the silence of the grave. Because the grave at least holds the promise of peace, while the Barrens hold only the promise of the clicking and the red eyes and the patient, systematic, eternal work of dismantling the human form and reducing it to a memory, a legend, a story told around campfires by those who do not believe, who cannot believe, who will never believe until the moment when they find themselves pinned to a tree with their ribcage snapped outward and their organs arranged on the sand beneath their feet, staring at the sky with eyes that are open and aware and horribly conscious of the creature that stands before them, processing them, consuming them, and waiting for the next intruder, the next skeptic, the next fool who thought that the wilderness was a resource to be managed rather than a predator to be feared. And in the distance, always in the distance, the clicking begins again. The hunt begins again. The Barrens wait, patient and eternal, for the next heartbeat to hammer against the next set of ribs, for the next skeptic to enter the territory, for the next story to be written in blood and bone and silence. Because the creature does not sleep. The creature does not die. The creature only waits and watches and remembers, and the remembering is the only immortality that the wilderness allows. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.